Slavoj Žižek, has a habit of beginning with the everyday. Take something as ordinary as buying a coffee. You step into a cafe, order your drink, and perhaps notice the label. Fair trade beans, a tree planted, a portion of the price donated somewhere far away. The cup doesn't just hold caffeine. It also carries a story, that your small act is part of something good. The twist is that this story is not added after the fact, but built into the product itself. What you purchase is not only the drink, but also the feeling that your consumption is already responsible. You enjoy the taste, and you enjoy the relief that you have done your part. The contradiction is clear. What looks like a free act of generosity is delivered to you as part of the transaction. This move, exposing contradictions hidden in familiar rituals, is central to Žižek's style. He rarely begins with abstract arguments. Instead, he takes films, jokes, and habits of everyday life, then reveals how they are stitched together with invisible rules. In the space of a few sentences, what once seemed innocent becomes strange. You see how ideology appears not in lofty theories, but in what feels most natural. The example of coffee is small, even playful, but it points to a larger theme. Our choices are never just our own. They come framed, shaped, and sometimes pre-packaged with the meanings we believe we are creating freely. That is why Žižek lingers on these details, because they reveal the background forces that structure our reality while remaining almost invisible. From this first gesture, the path of the series becomes clear. To follow Žižek's thought is to pay attention to these reversals, to the moments when daily life suddenly discloses its hidden logic. And from here, the stage opens onto Chapter 1, where the concept of ideology itself steps into view, the unseen background that makes every choice appear possible, natural, and free. The coffee twist is not a one-off. It shows the rhythm of Žižek's thinking. Begin with something familiar, then reveal how it already carries a hidden contradiction. What gives this method its force is the way he draws on three demanding traditions of thought and sets them into motion in daily life. From Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst, comes the claim that desire is never simply ours. We think we know what we want, but our desires are staged by others, by the gaze we imagine, by the stories we inherit, by unconscious scripts that run beneath awareness. If that is true, how much of what we call our own desires are really ours at all? Žižek uses Lacan to remind us that even our most intimate feelings may be borrowed. From Hegel comes the idea that contradiction is not a mistake, but the motor of truth itself. Progress happens through clashes, reversals, the collision of opposites. Could it be that confusion and conflict are not obstacles to knowledge, but its very pathway? Žižek's reading of Hegel suggests exactly this, that truth emerges through tension rather than harmony. From Marx comes the insight that capitalism is not just an economy, but a way of shaping our pleasures, our sense of freedom, even our feelings of guilt. These three names are only signposts for now. Each will return later in the journey, when their puzzles and provocations can be unfolded more fully. What matters here is how Žižek turns these abstract traditions into something strangely vivid. Take his use of jokes. We laugh because something surprises us, but often the surprise works because it expresses a truth we normally keep hidden. A laugh releases tension, yet in the same instant reveals what we would never say outright. Why does a joke, meant to hide discomfort, so often expose it instead? The contradiction is there in the structure of humor itself. The joke covers over discomfort by exposing it. Or consider his use of cinema. A film may reassure us with a story of love or heroism, but it works precisely because it stages the anxieties of a culture. We feel comfort because the narrative has already given form to our unease. What if entertainment is not an escape from ideology, but one of its clearest expressions? What looks like pure entertainment is also ideology at work. Even his style reflects this method. His lectures are full of digressions, interruptions, repeated anecdotes. At first, it seems chaotic, even careless. But the performance itself mirrors the contradictions he wants us to notice. A detour that feels like distraction often lands as the real point. The form enacts the philosophy. This is why Žižek matters, and why this series begins with him. He shows how philosophy is not separate from daily life, but pulsing through it, hidden in jokes, films, rituals, purchases. Once you see the reversals, the world tilts. What feels natural turns out to be staged. What feels free is already framed. What makes us laugh also unsettles. In the chapters ahead, those three signposts, Lacan, Hegel, Marx, will return one by one. But the core gesture is already visible. Contradiction revealed not in distant theory, but in the ordinary moments we rarely pause to question. In the film The Matrix, one scene has taken on a life of its own. Morpheus stands before Neo with two pills in his hands. The blue pill means returning to comfortable illusion. The red pill means waking up to the truth. It has become one of the most recognizable images in modern culture, repeated in memes, headlines, and everyday conversation. On the surface, the meaning feels obvious. Blue is denial, red is truth. To swallow the red pill is to be brave enough to face reality, however harsh. The scene seems to capture the very essence of liberation, the courage to leave illusions behind. But Žižek asks us to look again. He points out that the very frame of the choice is already ideological. Whether you pick red or blue, you remain inside the system that offered you the choice. Both options are staged. Even the act of rebellion, taking the red pill, is already scripted. The freedom on offer comes packaged within the same logic it claims to escape. This is the rhythm of his philosophy. What appears to be liberation often turns out to be another form of control. We assume ideology hides the truth from us, but in many cases, ideology tells us how to recognize truth in the first place. The Matrix is not just a story of waking up. It is a fantasy about how we imagine resistance. Step by step, the contradiction is simple. On the surface, red pill equals freedom, blue pill equals illusion. Beneath the surface, both choices confirm the system, because rebellion itself is part of how ideology sustains itself. The trick is not choosing differently, but questioning the stage on which the choice appears. This is why Žižek returns to films so often. They are not escapes from philosophy, but its most vivid stage. The red pill scene shows how culture both expresses and conceals the contradictions of our lives. And once you see this pattern, it appears everywhere. In the coffee we drink, the jokes we laugh at, the rituals we perform. As this example closes, the path leads back to the series as a whole. Philosophy here is less about comfort than disturbance, less about tidy answers than noticing how much of daily life is already shaped before we see it. From here, we move into reflection, and then onward to Chapter 1, ideology itself, the unseen background that makes all choices possible. As this introduction draws to a close, it is worth pausing on the scope of what lies ahead. Žižek does not only circle around ideology, though that is where he so often begins. His thought stretches further, into Lacan's puzzles about desire and fantasy, Hegel's insistence that contradiction is the motor of truth, and Marx's reminder that capitalism shapes not just work, but enjoyment and guilt. But these theoretical anchors are only one side. Žižek lingers on culture and jokes, showing how obscenity and humor reveal the hidden rules of authority. He unsettles our ideas of freedom, pointing out that the abundance of choices can itself become a trap. He broadens violence beyond explosions and crime to the quieter systemic forces that structure everyday life. And he presses on politics and ecology, asking how we might think again about what we hold in common. To follow him is not to receive tidy answers, but to take up a way of seeing, one that notices how contradictions shape desire, how ideology hides in rituals, how culture and politics are bound by fantasy. The laughter he provokes, the confusion he stirs, are not accidents, but part of the method. They remind us that disturbance itself can be clarifying. From here, the journey begins in earnest. Chapter 1 turns directly to ideology, the unseen background that shapes how life feels natural. From there, the exploration will move across other terrains, desire and fantasy, contradictions and freedoms, the pull of culture, the weight of politics. Each theme will appear not as an answer, but as another window onto the same puzzle, how our lives are already marked by structures we do not see. Chapter 1 Ideology. Every December, Coca-Cola returns with the same images: red trucks rolling through snowy landscapes, Santa with his jolly grin, families gathered around a glowing table. Whether on a billboard, a screen, or a can in the supermarket, the message is familiar. Coke is not just a drink, it is Christmas itself. To open the can is to join a ritual of joy and belonging, to take part in a scene repeated year after year. Starbucks offers a different but related promise. The paper cup in your hand tells you the beans are fair trade, a portion of the prize funds a project. Your purchase has a moral dimension. It is not only caffeine, but responsibility, a gesture of virtue tucked into the morning routine. And yet, notice the twist. Most of us know perfectly well that this is branding. We may even joke about it. Still, the logo reassures. Even in our cynicism, we act as if it delivers what it promises. Žižek seizes on this paradox. These small rituals appear trivial, yet they carry ideology in its most effective form. Ideology does not need us to believe sincerely. It works through habits and symbols that tell us how to desire, how to belong, how to feel virtuous. As he once put it, they know very well what they are doing, but still they are doing it. The contradiction is not buried deep, it is on the surface. Coke offers happiness, Starbucks offers morality, and we know the gesture is staged. But that knowledge does not stop us. On the contrary, it allows us to enjoy the ritual even more. We laugh at the trick while still playing along. This is ideology at its most powerful, not hidden behind lies, but woven into everyday practices we take for granted. From here, the path turns toward Žižek's rethinking of ideology itself, not as deception, but as the unconscious routines that shape our reality. When most people hear the word ideology, they imagine deception, false beliefs that trick people into accepting an unjust world. This was the classical Marxist view. The ruling class imposes illusions so that the exploited do not see the reality of exploitation. Ideology in this sense was like a veil hiding the truth. Žižek agrees that ideology is about illusion, but he shifts the emphasis. In modern life, the problem is not that we are naive. On the contrary, we are often perfectly aware. We roll our eyes at advertisements. We laugh at political slogans. We know very well that the products we buy do not save the planet, and yet we continue to participate. As Žižek puts it, they know very well what they are doing, but still they are doing it. This is the paradox of what he calls cynical distance. We imagine that by being ironic or skeptical, we are outside ideology. I don't really believe the ad, I just enjoy the drink. But the act itself, the buying, the ritual, the smile at the logo, still sustains the system. We think we have escaped, but our very cynicism is part of how ideology works. A familiar example is the way capitalism turns critique into fuel. If people worry about sweatshops, the company sells a conscious or fair trade line. If people feel guilty about climate change, a product comes with a green label or a promise to plant a tree. You do not need to believe the company is saving the world. All you need is the reassurance that by buying, you have already done something. Resistance becomes another business model. To understand why this works, Žižek draws on Lacan. Desire, he reminds us, is never straightforward. We don't want objects in themselves. We want them through the fantasies that surround them. A morning coffee is never just caffeine. It is the fantasy of responsibility, cosmopolitan belonging, or quiet self-care. The commodity comes wrapped in a little story about who we are and how the world should see us. Behind this stands what Lacan called the big other, the invisible authority that guarantees meaning. Even if I don't believe in the ethical label on my cup, I act as if someone else does. My gesture makes sense because society, or people, or the imagined other treats it as meaningful. The big other is not a person, but the social field itself, the background that makes rituals work even when we doubt them. So ideology today is not a simple trick played on the ignorant. It is the fabric of our practices, the fantasies that sustain our desires, the invisible rules of the big other. We may pride ourselves on being cynical, but that very cynicism allows the rituals to go on. If this is the case, then ideology cannot be reduced to false consciousness. It is something we live, which raises the question, if even our awareness of manipulation is already part of ideology, how can we ever step outside it? From here, the path turns to cinema, where these contradictions are staged with startling clarity. In the next part, we will look at They Live, a film where ideology is revealed not in theory, but through the simple act of putting on a pair of sunglasses. In John Carpenter's cult film They Live, the premise is simple but unsettling. A drifter played by rowdy Roddy Piper stumbles on a pair of sunglasses. When he slips them on, the world changes. Billboards no longer advertise cars or soft drinks. They reveal stark commands: obey, consume, marry, and reproduce. Money is stripped of its glamour and shows only a blank message. This is your God. The glasses make visible the hidden logic that structures everyday life. For Žižek, this is one of cinema's most brilliant depictions of ideology. We imagine ideology as something beneath appearances, a secret truth to be uncovered. But in They Live, the twist is that the messages are not hidden in the depths. They are written right on the surface. The billboards already tell us what to do. The glasses do not reveal a secret reality. They show us what was in front of us all along. This is why Žižek pairs They Live with more ordinary rituals. Think again of the Starbucks cup. You don't need magical sunglasses to see its command. It already announces that your purchase is ethical. that you are part of a virtuous ritual. The ideological message is printed directly on the packaging. We know this, and yet it works. The contradiction is that ideology succeeds not in spite of our awareness, but because of it. A similar pattern runs through the Matrix. When Morpheus offers Neo the choice between red pill and blue pill, the promise is liberation, to awaken from illusion. Yet Žižek reminds us that even this choice is staged by the system itself. The fantasy of rebellion is already part of how ideology sustains itself. People often sense this, which is why the blue pill, the comfort of illusion, remains so attractive. Films matter here because they make ideology tangible. A billboard that suddenly screams, "Obey," is more striking than a theoretical essay. A cup that preaches morality, or a pill that offers escape, dramatize contradictions in ways that theory alone cannot. This is why Žižek loves cinema. It is not a distraction from philosophy, but one of its richest stages. From here, the point begins to sharpen. Ideology is not most powerful when it deceives us, but when we think we see through it. And this leads to a deeper paradox, the subject of our next reflection. If ideology was simply a matter of false belief, it would be easy enough to escape. We could laugh at an advertisement, expose its illusion, and be free. But what we have seen is stranger. Ideology does not crumble when we know about it. It becomes stronger. The more we recognize the trick, the more we feel permitted to go on. Our cynical distance is not freedom from ideology. It is the very form in which ideology thrives. This is why Žižek insists that awareness is not enough. We know the cup does not change the world. We know the slogan is staged. We know the ritual is hollow. And yet this knowledge reassures us that participation is harmless. We think, of course I don't really believe, but our actions show that we do. The distance itself is folded back into belief. Here lies the paradox. Ideology is at its most powerful, not when we are deceived, but when we imagine ourselves clever enough to see through it. Our laughter, our irony, even our refusal to take things seriously, all feed the system we think we are resisting. So a question arises. If even our cynicism is ideological, if distance only tightens the grip, then what is it that keeps us acting as if the system holds? What sustains our rituals when belief has already collapsed? To answer this, Žižek turns to Lacan, to the strange logic of desire and fantasy, and to the figure of the big other, the invisible stage on which our gestures acquire meaning. That is where the journey continues in the next chapter. Chapter 2. Desire, Fantasy, and the Big Other. We've seen how ideology lingers not in what we confess to believe, but in the gestures and habits of daily life. Yet a deeper puzzle opens before us now. Think of the last time you stood quietly as a national anthem played, or when you bowed your head during a wedding vow, or even when you glanced at a flag fluttering in the wind and felt a twinge of recognition. You may not have felt stirred by patriotism or solemn faith. You may even have thought the ritual was outdated, perhaps even absurd. And still, you participated. You stood. You smiled. You played along. This is the paradox that Žižek loves to highlight. Belief does not live where we think it does. We imagine that it rests inside our heads, in private conviction. But often it survives outside us, in the very rituals and practices we continue to perform. We may laugh at them, roll our eyes, even declare ourselves disbelievers. Yet we salute, we sing, we behave as if we believe. In a strange way, our actions know more than our thoughts admit. This is not a trivial observation. It unsettles the very distinction between sincerity and hypocrisy. If a cynic stands for the anthem, are they betraying their disbelief? Or are they showing that disbelief itself is powerless against the weight of shared ritual? Here lies the contradiction. The less we believe internally, the more we seem to perform outwardly, as though belief must be maintained on behalf of some mysterious other. The flag doesn't need our private conviction to have power. It needs our continued gesture. Žižek's question follows naturally. Why do such rituals grip us, even after belief has withered? What secret force sustains their hold? If I know the flag is only cloth, why does saluting it still matter? If I see a diploma as just paper, why does treating it with reverence still matter? If God is dead, why do we still act in ways that assume someone else, somewhere, continues to believe? To unravel this knot, we need another vocabulary, one that doesn't treat belief as a simple matter of inner thoughts. For Žižek, Lacan provides that language: desire, fantasy, and the big other. These are the strange coordinates that allow us to understand why the ritual persists without belief, why the gesture can outlive conviction. Desire is never straightforward. Fantasy shapes what we see, and the big other silently guarantees that the game still counts. And so this chapter begins with a riddle. What if our most powerful beliefs are not the ones we carry in our hearts, but the ones we perform for others? When we ask why rituals and symbols grip us, even when belief itself falters, Žižek turns us to the language of Lacan. Lacan offers a map of human experience divided into three registers: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. These may sound abstract, but they can be explained in simple terms. The imaginary is the world of images and appearances, the realm where we first recognize ourselves in a mirror or compare ourselves with the faces we see around us. The symbolic is the order of language, law, and rules, the invisible network of customs and codes that tells us who we are and how to act. And the real is what neither words nor images can fully capture: the traumatic gap, the raw kernel that always escapes our attempts to frame it. Within this map, desire itself becomes strange. We imagine that we want things directly: this book, that person, a new phone. But Lacan insists that our desire is never quite our own. We desire what others seem to desire. We learn what to want by seeing it reflected in their gestures. This is why trends, fashions, and even rivalries become so powerful. We want the object not for itself, but because it is woven into a network of other people's wants. Yet we never encounter desire naked. It always arrives clothed in fantasy. Fantasy is the unconscious frame through which we interpret reality and orient our desires. It is not the daydream we consciously invent, but the silent backdrop that makes our actions meaningful. A child does not just want a toy. They imagine the toy as the thing that will make them complete, the key to happiness. As adults, we continue this pattern, dressing our desires in stories of fulfillment. And over all of this hovers what Lacan calls the big other. This is not a literal person, but the imagined authority that guarantees meaning: God, the law, society, tradition. Even when no one is watching, the big other is the silent witness that makes our acts count. We may not believe in God, but we behave as though someone else does. We may see money as mere paper, but we treat it reverently because others treat it that way. Here, Žižek's twist becomes clear. Ideology does not work by convincing us rationally. It stages our desires, it scripts our fantasies, it sustains the big other. Consider money again. Rationally, It is paper decorated with ink, yet to burn it feels like desecration. Why? Because the fantasy is not in the object, but in the social ritual around it, the shared fiction that gives the slip of paper its aura of power. And so we come to the paradox. Even when we know money is only paper, our actions reveal that we treat it as sacred because the big other believes for us. We obey not out of personal conviction, but because our desires and fantasies are tethered to an authority beyond us. But this raises another question. If ideology holds us not through ideas, but through fantasies, can we see this process at work in culture itself? In the next part, we will turn to film, where our hidden fears and desires are given vivid form. A shark rising from the deep, a nightmare that shields us from something far more unbearable. Picture the opening of Jaws. The camera glides beneath the waves, ominous music rising, and suddenly the calm surface of the ocean is split by violence. The shark itself barely appears on screen, yet its presence is felt everywhere. In the panic of swimmers, the hushed fear of the townspeople, and the stubborn denial of the mayor who insists the beaches must remain open. What makes this shark so terrifying is not its biological reality, but what it condenses. All the diffuse anxieties of the time, fears of institutional failure, Cold War dread, mistrust of official assurances, are gathered into a single figure of horror. In Lacanian terms, the shark is not simply an animal, but a fantasy object. Fantasy gives form to otherwise ungraspable anxieties, condensing dread into a single fightable image of the real. Instead of facing a world where danger is arbitrary, invisible, and impossible to master, we face a single predator. This is the paradox of fantasy. It reduces chaos to an image we can fight. Audiences know on one level that the shark is fake, that it is a mechanical prop conjured by Spielberg, and yet they leap in their seats, their bodies responding as if the threat were real. The fantasy works even in the face of disbelief. Žižek often insists that film is not merely entertainment, but a privileged site where ideology and fantasy externalize themselves. The shark in Jaws is not just a monster. It is a screen upon which society projects its deeper anxieties. To watch the movie is to experience how fantasy translates vague unease into a concrete, nameable figure. Instead of being paralyzed by a formless dread, we can imagine a single beast lurking under the water, one that might be defeated. A brief echo of this dynamic appears in The Matrix. There, people suspect the world is constructed, yet they prefer the fantasy of the simulation to the raw truth outside. Like the shark, The Matrix functions as a screen, a way to give unbearable reality a form we can live with. The difference is that in The Matrix, the fantasy sustains the entire world, while in Jaws, it sustains a town's sense of order. In both cases, fantasy structures our response more deeply than a rational belief ever could. So why does Žižek turn again and again to films? Because cinema shows us, more vividly than theory alone, how our desires and anxieties are staged. The mechanical shark becomes more than a prop. It reveals how fantasy itself works. The audience may laugh afterwards at how clunky the effects were, but in the moment they could not help reacting as though they were staring at the real. And this leads us back to the thread of the chapter. If fantasy shields us from what we cannot bear, does this mean that our entire sense of reality depends on illusions? We know our illusions. We can now see the strange logic at work. Ideology does not endure because we consciously believe in it, but because our desires and fantasies are stitched into its fabric. What holds us is not conviction, but the structure of the big other, that imagined authority of society, tradition, or law, which silently guarantees that our gestures count. The paradox is simple, yet unsettling. Even when we do not believe, we act as if someone else believes for us. A person may declare themselves an atheist, yet they lower their voice when speaking in a church, as though belief still resides in the building itself. Another may insist that a passport is just cardboard and ink, yet feel unease at damaging it, as though it carried something sacred. The sacredness lies not in the thing, nor even in our own thoughts, but in the sense that others, somewhere, continue to believe. In this way, disbelief itself sustains the ritual. Our very cynicism becomes proof that belief must exist elsewhere, that the big other is still intact. The less we believe privately, the more we behave respectfully, as though deferring to an unseen witness. It is not our conviction that matters, but the stage on which we act. This leaves us with an open question. If fantasy sustains reality itself, if the big other silently organizes what we desire and how we behave, can we ever truly step outside of it? Or would stepping outside mean stepping into a void too unbearable to face? The thread now points forward. If fantasy shields us, what happens when the shield cracks? When the real intrudes, tearing through our rituals and exposing their fragility, how do we respond? That will be the focus of the next chapter. Chapter 3. The Real, where meaning breaks down. There are moments when the fabric of reality seems to split, when the world no longer feels secure within the nets of meaning we normally rely on. You might recall the shock of an unexpected accident. 1 second, everything was ordinary. The next, the air itself felt strange, as though the ground of sense had slipped away. Or think of a dream that feels too real, the kind that unsettles you for hours afterwards. Even a joke can carry this effect. Most jokes make us laugh, but some strike too close to the bone, leaving us uneasy, as though something has been revealed we would rather keep hidden. These are not just odd experiences. They signal the limits of our ability to make sense of the world. Normally, language, customs, and rituals stitch together a coherent picture of reality. We act as though the world is stable, predictable, explainable. But in these moments of rupture, the stitching frays. Meaning itself seems fragile, provisional, even absurd. Žižek turns to Lacan to make sense of this. For Lacan, the real is not reality as we usually think of it. It is precisely what cannot be captured in our systems of meaning, what slips out of every story we try to tell. The real is not another hidden layer of reality waiting to be uncovered. It is the traumatic kernel that resists being put into words or images. In an earthquake, it is not just the ground shaking, but the collapse of the very framework that says, the ground is solid. In a dream too vivid to dismiss, it is the sense that reality itself is porous. Here lies the paradox. Ideology is what shields us from the real. Our rituals, symbols, and fantasies weave a screen that keeps the traumatic kernel at bay. Yet sometimes, the real intrudes anyway, and our protective screens falter. We glimpse something that does not fit, and for a moment, our world feels unstitched. This chapter will follow that thread. We will explore how Žižek uses Lacan's concept of the real to understand moments when meaning breaks down, how ideology normally protects us, why cracks inevitably appear, and what those cracks reveal about our deepest structures of belief. And so we begin with the unsettling question. If ideology shields us from the real, what happens when the real breaks through? To grasp what Žižek means when he speaks of the real, we need to pause with Lacan's three registers. They are not layers stacked neatly on top of one another, but coordinates that shape how we live in the world. The imaginary is the domain of images, mirrors, identifications, the world of appearances and illusions of wholeness. The symbolic is the web of language, law, and social order. It is not just grammar or etiquette, but the invisible network of rules that tells us who we are and what counts as meaningful. And then there is the real, the most unsettling register of all, that which cannot be fully symbolized, the traumatic kernel that no story, no image, no ritual can contain. Žižek seizes on this triad to rethink ideology. In his view, ideology is not primarily about deceiving us with false beliefs. It is about shielding us from the real, building screens of meaning to keep the raw trauma at bay. Our myths, laws, and rituals do not just tell us what to do. They protect us from confronting the void beneath. Yet cracks appear, and the real intrudes. When that happens, we glimpse the fragility of the systems that usually sustain our world. Consider the attacks of 9/11. It was not only an act of violence, but a rupture in the symbolic order. For many, it was literally unspeakable, an event that overwhelmed language. Why did the collapse of two towers feel like the collapse of an entire order of meaning? Because the real had intruded, showing that what we assumed stable, security, order, normality, could shatter in an instant. Or think of the refugee, a figure that unsettles the fantasies of social harmony. The refugee is not only a person in need, but also a presence that exposes the limits of our community's self-image. They confront us with the uncomfortable truth that our world of borders, identities, and protections is fragile, contingent, and violent in ways we prefer not to see. Comedy too can play this role. A crude or obscene joke often provokes laughter, but sometimes it catches us off guard, revealing more than we wanted. In that jolt, we sense that humor has brushed against the real, exposing the gap between our polite narratives and the raw contradictions underneath. Here lies the paradox Žižek wants us to notice. Ideology protects us from the real, yet the real is what makes ideology necessary in the first place. Without the traumatic kernel pressing at the edges of meaning, there would be no need for myths, rules, or rituals. The real both threatens our symbolic order and silently sustains it. And so we are left with an open tension. If ideology shields us from the real, what happens when that shield falters? Films can show us this confrontation with particular force, staging eruptions of the real in ways that theory alone cannot. That will be our focus next. Few films capture the sudden intrusion of the real as forcefully as Hitchcock's Psycho. The basement scene lingers in cultural memory precisely because it pushes past suspense into something more unsettling. Marion's sister descends the stairs, flashlight in hand, into the dimly lit cellar. There, in a rocking chair, sits what seems to be Norman's mother. The chair turns, the light falls, and the illusion shatters. She is not alive, but a mummified corpse, grinning grotesquely. It is not only the plot twist that horrifies, but the way this revelation seems to tear through the film's symbolic surface, exposing something that resists being explained. For most of the story, the film works within the familiar structures of crime and mystery. We can imagine motives, cover-ups, clues. Even Norman's strange behavior can be rationalized. But the basement reveal ruptures this framework. Here is not another piece of evidence to slot into a narrative, but a moment that overwhelms the narrative itself. the real emerges, not as hidden truth, but as something too raw to be fully integrated. This is what Žižek finds in cinema, the ability to stage, in concentrated form, the way fantasy and ideology usually protect us from the real, and what happens when those protections fail. Norman's fantasy of his mother sustains his fragile symbolic order. The community above, the police, the hotel, the town, all operate within recognizable rules. Yet in the basement, those rules collapse. The corpse is not just a secret. It is the eruption of something unspeakable, a presence that disturbs our sense of order itself. The contradiction is that the film relies on fantasy to draw us in, suspense, misdirection, plot mechanics. Yet its most powerful moment is when fantasy falls apart. We are forced to confront an image that refuses to be domesticated. Audiences scream not only because of the corpse, but because it breaks through the comfort of cinematic illusion, leaving us staring at a void the story cannot quite contain. Other films echo this dynamic. In The Matrix, the desert of the real shocks Neo out of comforting illusion. In Jaws, the shark condenses anxieties into a monstrous figure. But Psycho gives us the pure, concentrated shock of the real, the uncanny moment where the symbolic order itself caves in. And here lies the lesson Žižek draws from cinema. Film makes visible the fractures we usually cover over. On screen, we can look at the real. In life, when such moments arrive, we may prefer not to. We can now see why Žižek insists that the real is not some hidden layer of reality waiting to be uncovered, but the point where reality itself falls apart. Ideology protects us from this collapse, weaving stories, rituals, and symbols to shield us from what cannot be spoken. Yet every so often, the screen slips and the real intrudes. It might appear in the shock of disaster, in the unease of a joke that lands too close, or in the grotesque image that shatters narrative comfort. The paradox is that the real both terrifies and fascinates. It is what we cannot bear, and yet it is what compels us. We recoil from it, but it is also the pressure of the real that makes our protective fictions necessary in the first place. Without this traumatic kernel at the edges of our experience, there would be no need for the elaborate symbolic systems that give our lives coherence. Think of the laughter that suddenly reveals more than we intended, or the moment when a dream feels too real to dismiss. These cracks in the fabric of meaning unsettle us, but they also remind us that the world we inhabit is stitched together, fragile, dependent on the stories we tell. The real is the reminder of what those stories can never fully contain. And so we arrive at another question. If reality itself is always mediated by ideology, what does it mean to encounter what lies beyond? Can contradiction and rupture be more than breakdowns? Could they be the very way truth appears? This is where Žižek turns to Hegel. For Hegel, contradictions are not flaws in reality, but its deepest structure. The cracks we fear may be the openings through which truth emerges. That is where we will turn next. Chapter 4. Contradiction as Truth. Imagine a city with no laws. At first it feels intoxicating, a rush of pure liberty. But quickly the dream curdles. The loudest and strongest impose their will, and what looked like freedom becomes fear. Or think of love. We yearn for its intimacy, yet at the same time recoil from its demands. The way another's presence can unsettle our routines, expose our vulnerabilities, claim us in ways we never asked for. What we desire most always carries the shadow of what we dread. Žižek seizes on this paradox as the very ground of philosophy. Here he follows Hegel, who dared to claim that contradiction is not a flaw to be corrected, but the heartbeat of reality itself. Truth does not appear as harmony, as some final resting place where tension dissolves. Truth appears as the tension itself. Freedom exists only through the very limits that hold it in check. Love flourishes precisely through the anxieties it awakens. Identity takes shape not from seamless unity, but from cracks, failures, gaps. This takes us a step further from Lacan, whose real we encountered in the last chapter as a crack in experience. With Hegel, the crack is not an intruder from outside. It is reality's core. The real is not what interrupts the world's harmony, but the reason that harmony was never possible to begin with. Without tension, without fracture, nothing moves. So the provocation is simple and devastating. Contradiction is not to be solved. It is to be endured, even embraced. Hegel's dialectic is not the tidy dance of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where problems resolve neatly into higher wholes. For Žižek's Hegel, every apparent solution hides a deeper fracture. Every unity already carries its own undoing. Rather than fantasizing about escape from contradiction, we live through it. Our deepest truths, freedom, love, identity, are stitched together by the very tensions that threaten to tear them apart. To see this is to glimpse the strange, unsettling insight Žižek wants us to confront. Contradiction is not the obstacle to truth. Contradiction is truth. And if this is so, we must ask, what happens when we turn to the system most skilled at surviving its own contradictions? Capitalism. That question is coming. But first, we need to understand how Hegel's dialectic really works. Hegel is often caricatured as the philosopher of balance, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It sounds neat, like a machine for producing harmony out of conflict. But this is a distortion. For Hegel, the point is not that contradiction vanishes into unity, but that contradiction itself is what propels thought and life forward. It is not an error to be fixed, but the energy of reality. Žižek clings to this unfashionable insight. He insists that if we think of dialectics as a tidy ladder upward, we miss its radical edge. Dialectics is restless. Every resolution cracks apart. Every reconciliation conceals its own undoing. Hegel's system is not a monument to balance, but to imbalance, showing us that truth emerges through tension, never beyond it. Freedom offers the clearest case. When imagined as pure absence of restraint, it collapses into chaos. In practice, freedom becomes real only within limits. Traffic rules that prevent collision, contracts that stabilize trust, laws that make choices meaningful rather than dangerous. Constraint is not the enemy of freedom, but its condition. Remove the boundary, and the very thing we desire evaporates. Identity works the same way. We like to think of ourselves as possessing some stable inner truth, a self waiting to be uncovered. Yet what defines us is just as much what is missing: the failures, gaps, and fractures that interrupt the story we tell about ourselves. Žižek, drawing on both Hegel and Lacan, argues that negativity is not an accident of identity, but its structure. We are who we are not because of seamless unity, but because of what refuses to cohere. Žižek's style mirrors this movement. He rarely makes a claim without immediately reversing it. One moment, he declares that capitalism is collapsing. The next, that its crises are what keep it alive. This is not inconsistency, but method, what he calls a parallax view. The truth does not appear in a single, stable perspective, but in the oscillation between irreconcilable ones. The gap itself is what is real. To dwell in contradiction, then, is not to resign ourselves to confusion. It is to recognize that contradiction is what makes the world move. Life is not the absence of tension, but its continual working through. Without contradiction, there is no freedom, no love, no identity, no reality at all. And yet philosophy on its own can sound distant. To feel contradiction in our bones, Žižek turns to cinema, where chaos and order, rebellion and domination play out on screen with visceral force. It is there that we see contradiction not as an abstraction, but as lived experience. A mountain of burning cash. The Joker in The Dark Knight strikes a match and watches the flames climb. Around him, Gotham's mob bosses panic. Money is their anchor, their proof of order. For the Joker, it is tinder. His act makes a brutal point, that the city's fragile order does not stand on money or law, but on the constant possibility of collapse. He embodies the chaos that order both fears and depends on. Batman enters the story as Gotham's defender, its dark protector of law and justice. Yet the more he fights the Joker, the more he becomes bound to him. He cannot escape this strange tether, because his very identity as Batman requires an enemy who threatens the law. If Gotham were safe, Batman would have no reason to exist. Law, in the film, cannot exist without the threat of its transgression. Order needs its shadow. This is Hegel's dialectic playing out on screen. The Joker is not just Batman's adversary, but his condition of possibility. The struggle between them is not a conflict awaiting resolution, but a knot that sustains itself. Order exists only because chaos hovers at its edge. Justice only has meaning because injustice is always pressing in. The film never offers resolution. The final scenes are bleak, suspended, incomplete. But this incompleteness is the point. The contradiction is what drives the drama forward. For Žižek, this is why cinema matters. It does not merely illustrate contradiction. It makes us feel it. We don't just understand abstractly that order and chaos need one another. We see it in every confrontation between Batman and the Joker. In every impossible decision the film forces its characters to face. Contradiction becomes visible, visceral, undeniable. Through The Dark Knight, Žižek shows us that contradiction is not an error in the system, but the system's very pulse. Without Joker, there is no Batman. Without the possibility of collapse, there is no order to defend. The film is not about resolving this paradox, but about staging it, holding us within it. And that is what philosophy must do as well, not explain contradiction away, but teach us how to inhabit it. Contradiction, then, is not an intruder into life, but its rhythm. Freedom without limits collapses into chaos. Love without risk is no love at all. What unsettles us is also what makes things real. To live is to be caught between demands that never quite resolve. Seen in this light, contradiction is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to inhabit. The paradoxes we wrestle with, freedom and law, intimacy and fear, order and chaos, are not failures of reality, but its very form. They give shape to our choices, depth to our stories, tension to our desires. The world would be lifeless without them. The films we touched on show this vividly. In The Dark Knight, order needs the Joker's chaos to define itself. Their struggle is endless, but it is what keeps Gotham alive. That unresolved knot is not the flaw of the story, but its pulse. In life, too, it is often the tension that gives meaning to the whole. Žižek's wager is that philosophy should not rescue us from contradiction, but teach us how to dwell in it, to accept that reality is made of cracks, not despite them, but through them. The fracture is not outside truth, the fracture is truth. And yet, this insight only grows sharper when we turn to our economic and social world. What if contradiction is not only what drives our lives, but what fuels an entire system? What if there is a structure that survives precisely by turning crisis into renewal, breakdown into opportunity? That system is capitalism. And in Chapter 5, we will see how it thrives on contradiction like no philosophy ever dared to imagine. Chapter 5. Capitalism, an Ideology. Revisited. Imagine walking through a brightly lit shopping mall where polished storefronts promise not only style, but also meaning. In one window, a rack of Che Guevara t-shirts hangs neatly folded, complete with price tags and seasonal discounts. The image is striking because Che himself was once a symbol of armed resistance to capitalism. Here, his face, stern, defiant, is reduced to an accessory, a fashion statement. What was once a call to revolution now sells for $19.999. The paradox is unavoidable. Rebellion itself becomes a product, absorbed into the very system it set out to overthrow. This is not an isolated curiosity. Today, resistance often arrives prepackaged and ready for purchase. Eco-friendly tote bags announce virtue while dangling from our arms. Activist slogans are screen-printed on sweatshop-produced hoodies. Even our shopping rituals are laced with small performances of dissent. Fair trade coffee that lets us believe we sip justice with our morning latte, or conscious consumer lines in supermarkets that promise the taste of ethics along with organic fruit. The contradiction is not hidden. It is right there in the act. By consuming differently, we imagine we resist consumption. Žižek captures this tension with one of his most famous provocations. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The sentence sounds apocalyptic, but it points to something every day. We can easily picture rising seas or collapsing economies, entire civilizations swept away. What we struggle to picture is a world where our very coordinates of buying and selling, working and desiring are otherwise. Even when we rebel, we do so by consuming in new ways, in ways the market welcomes. The very act of critique is recycled into new niches, new business models, new lifestyle choices. This leads us back to a thread from the previous chapter. The idea that contradiction is not a flaw to be smoothed over, but the very texture of truth. Capitalism embodies this insight with uncanny precision. It doesn't merely survive contradictions, it thrives on them. Each attempt to puncture its logic becomes a new seam it can stitch into its fabric. Critique, far from threatening collapse, becomes a source of renewal. The question, then, is how this dynamic works. Why does capitalism not only endure its contradictions, but transform them into new avenues of growth? To answer, we must turn from this opening paradox, the Che shirt, the tote bag, the ethical latte, to the deeper theoretical structures that explain why contradiction doesn't kill capitalism, but keeps it alive. That is where we go next. Classical Marxism saw capitalism as a machine destined to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The system, Marx argued, thrives on exploitation. It depends on workers producing more value than they receive in wages. This imbalance generates tensions between labor and capital, between overproduction and underconsumption, that should eventually push capitalism into crisis. In the traditional story, these cracks widen until the system can no longer sustain itself. Revolution follows. Žižek, however, suggests something far more unsettling. Capitalism does not merely withstand its contradictions, it flourishes because of them. Where Marx expected breakdown, we find adaptation. Contradictions that should tear the system apart instead become its lifeblood, transformed into new opportunities for profit. The system does not deny its flaws, it commodifies them. Consider environmental crisis. Rising seas, melting glaciers, polluted air, all appear as symptoms of capitalist excess. Yet rather than signaling the end of capitalism, they open space for new markets. Companies rush to sell green products, from electric cars to biodegradable packaging, which allow us to consume while reassuring ourselves that we are repairing the damage. The contradiction between consumption and sustainability is not resolved, it is monetized. Or take anti-consumerist rebellion. Movements that reject mass fashion are quickly absorbed into boutique brands selling curated anti-fashion. Punk once spat in the face of corporate culture. Within a decade, even Doc Martens, once a symbol of working-class defiance, ended up stacked neatly in suburban malls. What begins as resistance soon becomes just another display in the shop window. Žižek also points to the ideology of liberal tolerance. Here, diversity and inclusion are celebrated as proof of freedom. Advertisements showcase rainbow flags, multicultural lineups, slogans of empowerment. Yet behind the surface lies a blind spot. The structures of exploitation that enable production remain intact. The worker stitching rainbow merchandise in precarious conditions rarely features in the ad. Tolerance becomes a commodity in itself, a selling point that allows us to feel progressive while the machinery of inequality hums unchanged. The Starbucks ritual, first introduced in our opening chapter, makes this logic plain. Buying a latte becomes not just consumption, but an ethical act. A portion of profits helps farmers or supports sustainable practices. We do not simply drink coffee, we participate in a moral narrative. Lacan would call this a perfect illustration of enjoyment, tangled with guilt and absolution. We desire the product, but we also want to feel clean, to be absolved of complicity. Capitalism accommodates both impulses. It lets us indulge while telling us that indulgence is virtue. From a Hegelian angle, this is negativity at work. Capitalism doesn't smooth over its cracks, it feeds on them. Contradictions are not weaknesses to be hidden, but dynamic tensions that keep the system moving. The brokenness itself becomes productive. Crisis does not signal the end, but the beginning of another cycle of profit. This is why, for Žižek, capitalism seems almost immortal. Each critique becomes a market. Each crisis produces new products. Each rebellion generates another brand. What looks like fragility is resilience. Yet this dynamic is easier to grasp not only through theory, but also through culture. Film, in particular, offers vivid windows into how capitalism metabolizes its own critique. To see this paradox play out in flesh and image, we turn to cinema, where rebellion itself is staged, commodified, and sold back to us as spectacle. Few films capture the paradox of capitalism's resilience better than Fight Club. At first glance, it seems to embody the ultimate rejection of consumer culture. The nameless narrator wanders through IKEA catalogues, suffocated by flat-pack identity. His world is built from the logic of endless choice, where personality is expressed through sofa design and lighting fixtures. Tyler Durden arrives as the figure of rebellion, tearing away the veil of commodity satisfaction with a clenched fist. The first fight is raw, liberating, a violent refusal of consumerist comfort. But rebellion quickly shifts into its opposite. The underground club becomes Project Mayhem, a movement that demands total obedience. What began as resistance to domination mutates into a new domination, with members shaving their heads, chanting rules, erasing individuality. The attempt to escape the prison of consumerism simply constructs another prison, one with its own uniforms and commandments. Here the contradiction reveals itself. The very effort to step outside the system reproduces its logic. Rebellion becomes indistinguishable from conformity. The irony does not end there. Fight Club itself, a film critiquing consumer society, became a consumer product par excellence. Its posters adorned dorm rooms, its quotes printed on t-shirts, its DVD marketed as a cult item for purchase. What was once a howl against empty consumption found itself neatly packaged for the very marketplace it sought to reject. The act of critique was not neutralized, but monetized, turned into another commodity that circulates in the culture industry. This is precisely why Žižek turns to cinema. Films are not illustrations of theory pasted on after the fact. They are laboratories where contradictions take vivid form. The tension between rebellion and conformity, critique and commodity, is not abstract but played out in flesh, image, and sound. We see in the arc of Fight Club how capitalism metabolizes its own negation, transforming it into spectacle. Other films echo the pattern. Wall-E presents ecological collapse as a charming Pixar narrative, turning disaster into entertainment. The Matrix invites us to imagine breaking free from illusion, only to become one of the most merchandised franchises in film history. Each example shows how critique, once captured on screen, circulates as a product. The lesson is not merely that capitalism is cunning, but that it survives precisely by commodifying what should threaten it. To watch Fight Club is to experience a strange loop. We critique consumerism by consuming a film about critiquing consumerism. And so, the question deepens. If every act of resistance risks being absorbed and sold back to us, what could it mean to truly step outside the loop? That is where we turn as this chapter draws to a close. As we step back from these examples, a troubling picture comes into view. Capitalism is not weakened by critique. It grows stronger when it seems to embrace it. The Che Guevara shirt in the mall, the fair trade latte, the cult of Fight Club, each illustrates the same paradox. What looks like resistance becomes another cycle of consumption. The system appears fragile, as if one more crisis or one more rebellion might topple it. And yet it is precisely in crisis, precisely in dissent, that capitalism discovers its resilience. The contradiction here is sharp. We imagine that to resist is to weaken the machine. But often our very acts of resistance are what keep it alive. Revolutionary icons rebranded as logos, coffees marketed as moral absolution, films that critique consumerism turned into merchandise. Each case shows how fragility is recycled as strength. Capitalism thrives on its cracks, turning breakdown into renewal. What follows from this recognition is not despair, but a question. If critique itself fuels the system, then what kind of challenge could ever escape absorption? Is there a form of refusal that cannot be turned into a commodity? Or must resistance itself be rethought from the ground up? Žižek leaves us with the discomfort of this open space. Not a roadmap out, but an awareness of the trap. And this question leads us toward the next chapter. If capitalism survives precisely by appearing tolerant, diverse, and self-critical, then what happens to our sense of freedom? Perhaps our very experience of freedom is the most effective disguise, the ideology that binds us most tightly. In Chapter 6, we turn to Žižek's unsettling claim that freedom itself may be the most deceptive ideology of all. Chapter 6. Freedom is a trap. The most dangerous kind of unfreedom is the one that feels like freedom. Imagine standing at McDonald's. The cashier asks whether you want Coke or Diet Coke. The exchange feels like a small act of autonomy, a chance to declare your taste. Yet the real decision, whether to drink Coke at all, was already taken away. The space of freedom has been carefully drawn in advance, and all you can do is move within its borders. A similar pattern plays out in the glow of a laptop screen. You scroll through page after page of shoes on an online store, hundreds of styles and colors, the horizon of choice stretching seemingly without end. The act of scrolling feels liberating, almost intoxicating, a rush of possibility. But the framework is already fixed. The choice is never whether you need another pair of shoes or whether consumerism itself shapes your desire. What is presented as freedom of choice is already a kind of unfreedom, a menu without exits. This is Žižek's provocation. Freedom is most deceptive, precisely when it feels most plentiful. The modern subject, faced with endless aisles of products and ballots of political parties, experiences freedom as an abundance of options. Yet this abundance conceals a deeper hollowness. The more choices we are offered, the less we notice the structure that defines the choices themselves. It is like being trapped in a supermarket whose shelves are always full, but whose doors are locked. You can roam the aisles forever, but you can never leave. Here lies the paradox. The very sensation of freedom can be the mechanism of unfreedom. The experience of liberty, choosing between Coke and Diet Coke, between brands of shoes, between parties that all accept the same underlying economic rules, is how our lack of freedom sustains itself. This tension is where our journey in this chapter begins. In the next step, we move from the surface of choices to the deeper question. What happens when we stop picking from the menu and start questioning the menu itself? In liberal societies, freedom is usually imagined as the ability to choose between options. You enter a voting booth and select one candidate or another. You browse the aisles of a store and pick this brand or that one. Freedom, in this sense, is reduced to the act of choosing, the sovereign moment where your will is expressed. Yet Žižek argues that this notion of freedom conceals more than it reveals. The problem is not the options themselves, but the framework within which those options appear. Democracy provides the clearest example. At election time, you are invited to choose between left and right, between parties that argue over tax rates or social policies. But the deeper economic coordinates, the acceptance of capitalism as the unquestioned horizon, remain outside debate. The citizen experiences freedom as the right to select, but the range of choices has already been structured so that the most radical questions never appear on the ballot. Freedom here is genuine, but partial, and its very partiality functions as a form of unfreedom. Consumer culture extends this logic into daily life. You scroll endlessly through Netflix, flicking between comedies, thrillers, or documentaries. The act of browsing feels like freedom, a buffet of possibilities. Yet the recommendation system already anticipates and steers your desires, narrowing the field before you even notice. The same is true of social media feeds. You feel as though you are curating your own world, yet algorithms quietly filter what you see. determining not only what you encounter, but what you come to desire. The apparent abundance of options masks a structure that governs them all. Lacan offers a parallel insight into desire. We like to think of our desires as intimate, unique, the essence of who we are. Yet Lacan insists that desire is always mediated by the big other, the symbolic order of culture and language. What we want is never simply what we want. It is shaped by expectations, advertising, algorithms, and social norms. To crave a pair of shoes, to long for a holiday destination, to scroll compulsively through short videos, is to occupy a script already written. Desire feels personal, but is in fact structured. In this way, the freedom to follow your desire can be another mechanism of unfreedom. You are obeying a command that presents itself as your deepest wish. Hegel pushes the paradox further. For him, freedom is never raw spontaneity, the pure ability to do whatever one pleases. Freedom only exists through constraint. A musician is free to improvise only because they have first submitted to years of scales and practice. Language itself frees us to speak and think, but only by binding us to grammar and shared meaning. Far from being opposed, constraint and freedom are inseparable. Yet in consumer culture, freedom is reduced to the shallow act of selecting between products, lifestyles, or identities, as though freedom were infinite flexibility. The deeper truth is that such flexibility binds us ever more tightly to the system that provides it. This is Žižek's paradox. The experience of freedom may itself be our deepest unfreedom. The more lifestyle options we are offered, the less we notice the structure that shapes them. The menu expands endlessly, yet the menu itself is never up for debate. This contradiction sets the stage for our next step. Cinema, Žižek suggests, makes this paradox visible in ways philosophy alone cannot. Films like The Matrix and The Truman Show dramatize the uncanny experience of choice within a frame that is already fixed. Through them, we can glimpse how ideology scripts even our most private sense of freedom. Few cultural texts capture the paradox of freedom better than cinema. Think of The Matrix, a film that has become a kind of shorthand for philosophical awakening. Neo, the reluctant hero, is offered a moment of radical choice. Swallow the blue pill and remain in comfortable illusion, or take the red pill and awaken to the truth of the system. At first glance, this is the very essence of freedom, a single decision that separates ignorance from liberation. But Žižek reminds us that even here, the freedom is staged. The red pill and the blue pill are both part of the same script, written by the system itself. Neo's destiny is already inscribed before he swallows anything. What appears as a decisive break is itself a carefully orchestrated choice within the logic of the Matrix. This is what makes the film so unsettling. The gesture that promises liberation is already contained within the structure of control. You can exit one layer of illusion only to find yourself inside another. In this way, the Matrix dramatizes Žižek's claim that freedom is most deceptive when it feels most intense. To choose the red pill feels like a revolutionary act, yet it is precisely the act that the system has anticipated, even required, to keep its machinery intact. A gentler, but no less haunting example arrives in The Truman Show. Truman Burbank lives in a world filled with apparent choices. He selects a breakfast cereal. He greets neighbors. He pursues dreams of travel. Yet all of it takes place under the invisible dome of a television set. His freedom is meticulously staged, every conversation scripted, every street corner designed. Truman believes He is free because he is constantly choosing, but his entire field of choices is sealed within the architecture of the show. It is only when he literally touches the edge of the dome, the painted sky against which his world is projected, that he glimpses the possibility of a freedom beyond the script. These films reveal something theory alone can struggle to convey: how ideology does not suppress freedom from outside, but shapes it from within. In The Matrix, the most defiant act of liberation is still an expected move in the game. In The Truman Show, the daily experience of ordinary choice is what sustains the illusion of autonomy. Both remind us that freedom can be performed as spectacle, while its limits remain unseen. Žižek often insists that cinema does philosophy in images. Where concepts may seem abstract, a film scene gives them flesh. Watching Neo reach for the pill or Truman press against the dome, we encounter the strange truth that freedom and unfreedom are not opposites, but entangled. These cinematic metaphors prepare us for the reflective step that follows, to ask what it would mean not simply to choose within the frame, but to question the frame itself. We began with the small gestures of freedom, Coke or Diet Coke, this brand or that film, and uncovered the deeper paradox. Our freedom often disguises its own limits. The abundance of choice, the scrolling menus and crowded shelves presents itself as liberation, yet it silently narrows the field of what can be imagined. The more we are invited to choose, the less we notice the structure that shapes all possible choices. This is the strange knot Žižek calls unfreedom. The experience of freedom itself can be the mechanism of our confinement. We feel free precisely when we are most entangled in the logic of the system. Like Truman waving to his neighbors, or Neo swallowing the red pill, our sense of autonomy may itself be the proof that we remain inside the frame. The open question, then, is what lies beyond the menu? What would it mean not just to pick differently, but to refuse the act of picking altogether? Real freedom may begin not in multiplying our options, but in confronting the framework that silently sets them. Yet such a gesture is always disruptive, even dangerous. To step outside the coordinates of choice is to risk tearing the fabric of the system itself. And this brings us to the darker edge of Žižek's thought. What happens when people try to break beyond the frame? What forms of violence, symbolic or real, erupt when the coordinates of choice are no longer accepted? This is where our next chapter begins. Chapter 7. Violence Beyond the Obvious. The television flickers late at night. On the screen, overturned cars, smoke rising, glass shattered across the pavement. Reporters speak urgently over images of masked figures clashing with police. The location could be London or Paris or New York. It hardly matters. The image of riot has become familiar, instantly recognizable as violence. It frightens, but also fascinates, because it seems to rupture the order of everyday life. Yet here, a tension appears. Why do we take these spectacular eruptions as the very essence of violence, while overlooking the quieter wounds that shape millions of lives each day? A man freezing on the street, a child going to school hungry, an elderly woman denied health care she cannot afford. These things rarely make breaking news. They are accepted as background, as if they were natural facts of life. But are they not forms of violence too? Žižek asks us to broaden the lens. Violence is not only the sudden act that smashes the window, it is also what disappears into normality. We condemn the rioter throwing a stone, but not the economic system that breeds despair. We recoil from terrorism, but turn away from the ongoing devastation of poverty or the bureaucratic cruelty that leaves refugees in limbo. The unsettling shift is this: violence has many faces. There is subjective violence in visible acts, but also symbolic violence in the categories that wound, and systemic violence in the very structures that organize society. What appears as peace often rests on coercion. What looks like stability may itself be brutal. The most dangerous violence may not be the sudden eruption, but the harm so embedded in the everyday that we no longer notice it. Žižek distinguishes three interwoven forms of violence. Subjective violence is visible, concrete, disruptive. Riots, terrorist attacks, individual crimes. It dominates headlines because it interrupts what we consider normal. It produces spectacle. And because it produces spectacle, it defines our imagination of what violence means. But beneath it lies symbolic violence, the violence of language and categories. A slur wounds not through physical force, but by excluding someone from recognition. A bureaucratic form that erases identity, a label that marks some lives as worth less. These are subtle but deeply shaping forms of harm. Symbolic violence determines who is heard, who is ignored, who counts. Deeper still is systemic violence, the ongoing harm built into political and economic systems themselves. Poverty, displacement, climate breakdown, preventable disease. These are not mere accidents of nature. They are consequences of how our systems are organized. A riot may injure dozens, but austerity policies can scar generations. Climate injustice ensures that those least responsible for emissions suffer the worst effects. Healthcare inequality means a treatable illness becomes a death sentence for those without money. And yet, here lies the reversal. We rarely call systemic violence violence at all. Media frame the riot as an emergency, while the slow violence of poverty or ecological collapse appears as background scenery. Ideology functions precisely here, by narrowing our gaze to the bad actor while obscuring the machinery that makes suffering inevitable. Žižek draws on Lacan's idea of the real, that which cannot be fully symbolized, returning as trauma. Outbreaks of riots or unrest are eruptions of the real. They are not just irrational explosions, but signals of a deeper trauma the system cannot hide forever. Hegel sharpens the point. We think of peace as the absence of violence, but Hegel reminds us that peace itself is sustained by coercion and exclusion. The contradiction is that what looks like harmony already contains its own brutality. For Žižek, the real scandal is not when violence breaks the rules, but when the rules themselves are violent. Cinema often crystallizes what philosophy circles around. In Children of Men, terrorist attacks and bombings shock society. But as the story unfolds, the deeper violence is revealed in the refugee camps, cages overflowing, cruelty routine, human life reduced to bare survival. The spectacular explosions are frightening, but the systemic exclusion corrodes society more profoundly. In The Purge, violence is ritualized as spectacle. One night when murder is legal. The audience recoils at the killings, yet the true violence lies in the inequality that makes the ritual possible. The rich barricade themselves behind security systems. The poor are left exposed. What appears as chaotic freedom is in fact the careful preservation of systemic order. And in Joker, 2019, media fixate on Arthur Fleck's killings. Yet Gotham itself is structured by cruelty, cuts to social services, contempt for the vulnerable, elites who sneer at the poor. Arthur's outbursts are shocking, but they are symptoms of a system that humiliates its most fragile members. The scandal is not that one man snapped, but that a city made such snapping inevitable. Each film dramatizes the same contradiction. Our fixation on subjective violence blinds us to the systemic and symbolic violence that makes it possible. Spectacle distracts us from structure. By staging this tension, cinema performs philosophy. It unsettles us, urging us to see beyond what is obvious. We began with shattered glass and burning cars. But Žižek's provocation is that violence extends far beyond what explodes in front of us. It lives in the hunger we overlook, the paperwork that excludes, the economic order that condemns some to despair while protecting others. Here is the contradiction. What we call peace is often saturated with harm. A society without riots may still be deeply violent if its systems grind down the vulnerable. Nonviolence can become a mask, a way of hiding the everyday brutality that sustains order. The reflective question, then, is how we might learn to see this invisible violence without falling into cycles of spectacle ourselves. If the rules themselves are violent, how do we respond without merely repeating another eruption? The challenge is to cultivate perception, to recognize violence not only in its noise, but in its silence. This line of thought leads naturally forward. To see the hidden structures of violence is to begin looking at culture itself, at jokes, rituals, even toilets, the everyday practices where ideology reveals its obscene underside. In the next chapter, Žižek takes us there, showing how the trivial and the comic can carry profound truths about power and harm. Chapter 8. Pop Culture, Jokes, and the Obscene Underside. Imagine a philosopher standing before an audience, ready to unravel the mysteries of ideology, and instead of quoting Aristotle or Kant, he begins to describe toilets. Slavoj Žižek has often pointed out how the small differences in toilet design across Europe, the French, the German, the Anglo-American, reveal more than engineering quirks. For him, even the way waste disappears from view carries traces of cultural assumptions about purity, shame, and the social order. It is a strangely comic starting point, yet it unsettles us. Why would philosophy begin with the toilet bowl? Precisely because it is where ideology hides most effectively, not in grand theories, but in the infrastructure of the everyday. Žižek is equally known for peppering his lectures with obscene jokes. At first, they seem like digressions, a way to keep a drowsy audience awake. But the deeper paradox is that these jokes do not distract from philosophy. They are philosophy. A dirty joke reveals what polite discourse conceals, the obscene underside that sustains authority. A boss may demand respect in public, but in the private circle of colleagues, the shared laughter at something crude creates the real bond of loyalty. Žižek reminds us that obscenity is not the opposite of dignity. It is the hidden support that allows dignity to function. This fascination with the trivial and the obscene is not a lapse in seriousness, but a method. Where traditional philosophy might begin with noble ideas of truth and beauty, Žižek insists that the true mechanisms of ideology become visible only in the margins, in jokes, rituals, and popular culture. The paradox is sharp. What appears least serious turns out to be most revealing. When he analyzes a cartoon or a Hollywood blockbuster, it is not to bring philosophy down to a pop level, but to show that ideology itself already operates there. Culture is never just entertainment. So, when Žižek turns our attention to toilets or jokes, he is not mocking philosophy. He is demonstrating that the unconscious is hiding in plain sight, woven into the trivia of everyday life. His lesson is unsettling. If ideology is sustained not only by solemn beliefs, but also by laughter, habits, and enjoyment, then it pervades even the moments we imagine to be most innocent. And this sets the frame for what follows. Žižek's philosophy is not a retreat into the abstract. It is an exploration of how our fantasies and our laughter, our rituals and our entertainment are where the truth of ideology most clearly announces itself. Why does Žižek keep returning to toilets, dirty jokes, pornography, and Hollywood blockbusters? At first glance, these obsessions seem unserious, even distracting. Philosophy, we might think, should deal with freedom, truth, and justice, not with cartoons or toilet bowls. But for Žižek, it is precisely in these marginal and low cultural spaces that ideology does its most effective work. The trivial is never trivial. It is where social structures become flesh, where the unconscious leaks out, where the contradictions of a system reveal themselves. Culture, in this sense, is not an escape from ideology, but its very home. When we watch a film, laugh at a joke, or decorate a Christmas tree, we participate in rituals that do more than entertain us. They silently reproduce the frameworks of authority and belief. Think of the politician who appears on stage with solemn words of national dignity, but who shares obscene jokes behind closed doors. The jokes do not undermine authority. They sustain it. They form the invisible glue of solidarity among those in power. Žižek's point is unsettling. Authority does not rest only on public rituals of respect, but also on the hidden enjoyment of obscenity. The polished surface of dignity depends on a backstage economy of laughter. Here, Lacan becomes crucial. For Lacan, the unconscious is not buried in some inaccessible depth. It is woven into our ordinary speech, our slips of the tongue, our recurring jokes, the small rituals we repeat without thinking. Žižek radicalizes this insight. The obscene story told in private is not just entertainment. It is the unconscious of ideology itself, speaking in plain daylight. What is repressed returns, but it returns in the form of laughter. Hegel gives this another twist. For Hegel, the truth of a system often shows itself not in its ideals, but in its contradictions and its excesses. The very place where an order seems to fail or become ridiculous is the place where its truth shines through. Žižek applies this to culture. When we encounter the excess of obscenity or the silliness of a ritual, we are not seeing something outside ideology, but its very kernel. The ridiculous is revelatory. Take Christmas. Few adults truly believe in Santa Claus, and yet the rituals of Christmas, the decorated tree, the gift-giving, the exchange of greetings, carry enormous emotional weight. We don't need literal belief. It is enough that we act as if we believe. The enjoyment of the ritual is what sustains the ideology of family, community, and tradition. This is why Žižek insists that ideology functions not at the level of belief, but at the level of enjoyment. You may cynically dismiss Santa, but you still take part in the ritual, and in doing so, you keep the ideology alive. This is also why Žižek insists on drawing from low culture, pornography, cartoons, blockbusters. It is not to provoke for the sake of provocation, nor to make philosophy trendy. It is to show that the highest operations of ideology are sustained by the lowest cultural forms. The contradiction is sharp. What seems least serious, a dirty joke, a cartoon panda, a Hollywood disaster film, is what reveals ideology at its most serious. In turning philosophy toward these margins, Žižek is making a wager. If truth hides in contradiction, if ideology sustains itself through enjoyment rather than belief, then to grasp our world we must look not at what people say they believe, but at what they laugh at, what rituals they repeat, what fantasies they cannot do without. This is the terrain we now enter. To see Žižek's method in action, we must follow him into the cinema. For it is often in films, especially the grand spectacles of popular culture, that the obscene underside of ideology stages itself most clearly. Part 3. Film illustration. Žižek's most famous trick is to move effortlessly from Lacan to Hollywood. But what matters is not simply that he quotes films. It is that he treats them as philosophy itself, places where the unconscious of ideology is staged more clearly than in theory. Films, in his reading, are not distractions from reality. They are the dreamwork of culture, staging its contradictions and excesses. Take The Matrix. Earlier, we saw how Žižek used it to raise questions of freedom and choice. Here, the emphasis shifts. For him, the film is less about choosing between illusion and reality, and more about how fantasy sustains reality itself. When Neo wakes up in the desert of the real, the first thing he does is immediately seek another fantasy. Žižek's point is that reality, left bare, is unbearable. We need illusions not to escape the real, but to inhabit it. The Matrix is not a prison we can simply step out of. It is the fantasy structure that allows reality to function. Or take Hitchcock's Psycho. The polite surface of the Bates Motel, the neatly kept rooms, the smiling host, depends on the obscene underside hidden in the basement. Žižek reads the film not just as horror, but as an allegory of how authority works. Every dignified surface, every respectable institution has its obscene supplement. The very structure of the house mirrors ideology, the main floor of polite appearances, the attic of lofty ideals, and the basement where the repressed obscenity lurks. The horror is not that there is a basement, but that we cannot have the house without it. Žižek delights in taking this logic further, into the most unexpected places. He has famously explained Lacan through Kung Fu Panda. A cartoon panda, destined to be a hero despite his laziness, becomes a way of thinking about the empty gesture at the heart of authority, that there is no secret ingredient behind power, only our belief in it. The joke is not a detour. It is the very point. Even in children's cartoons, ideology shows its hand. And in today's landscape of memes and Marvel films, the same dynamic continues. A superhero franchise presents itself as pure entertainment, yet beneath the battles of good and evil lies a constant reassurance. Our world may be flawed, but it is ultimately defended by higher powers. Memes, meanwhile, spread jokes that seem light, yet encode entire political positions in a single image. Once again, the apparently trivial becomes decisive. Through these cinematic and cultural readings, Žižek's method becomes clear. To grasp ideology, one must look not at solemn declarations of belief, but at the fantasies and jokes that sustain us. Cinema, cartoons, even memes. These are not marginal curiosities. They are the theatres in which ideology stages its obscene underside with full force. As we step back, the pattern becomes clear. Žižek's turns to toilets, jokes, and cartoons are not digressions from philosophy, but its very continuation. What looks like the least serious, a crude joke, a cartoon panda, even the way a toilet flushes, is precisely where ideology secures its hold. The paradox is sharp. The truths we imagine to lie in lofty ideals instead emerge in the obscene and the everyday. To laugh at a dirty joke, to decorate a Christmas tree, to cheer at a superhero film. These are not innocent diversions. They are ways of inhabiting ideology, of keeping the machinery of belief running, even when we claim to be skeptical. The joke binds us, the ritual sustains us, the fantasy carries us through the unbearable. The unconscious does not whisper from a hidden depth. It announces itself in what we laugh at, in what we repeat, in what we enjoy. The unsettling thought, then, is this: if even our laughter, our entertainment, our moments of escape are saturated with ideology, is there anywhere outside of it? Or is ideology less a mask to be torn away and more the very fabric of our everyday life, the fantasies that let us bear reality? Žižek leaves us with a discomfort that is also a kind of clarity. To take pop culture seriously is not to trivialize philosophy, but to recognize where philosophy must begin. For if the truth of our world is disclosed in its jokes and its cartoons, then the task is not to rise above them, but to listen more closely to what they reveal. And this question, whether we can find a position outside ideology or whether our politics must be forged from within it, leads directly into our next chapter. There, we turn from toilets and films to the terrain of politics, liberalism, and the commons, asking what it means to act when even our enjoyment is already part of the system. Chapter 9. Politics, Liberalism, and the Commons. The scene is familiar. A summit of leaders, cameras flashing, hands clasped in ritualized gestures of friendship. Smiles are rehearsed, words carefully chosen, promises of stability, progress, and unity. Watching such images, one might feel reassured. Everything looks orderly, as if politics itself had been reduced to a question of competent administration. Problems to be solved by experts, disputes ironed out through compromise. Yet beneath this appearance, a strange unease lingers. Why does politics so often feel less like a struggle over visions of society, and more like a board meeting in which rival executives balance budgets and draft efficiency plans? Žižek calls this condition post-politics. Here, conflicts are not framed as clashes of ideology or competing notions of justice. Instead, they are presented as technical puzzles, matters of adjustment. Climate change becomes a question of carbon pricing, not of rethinking our mode of production. Poverty is addressed through inclusion initiatives, rather than asking why wealth is hoarded so unevenly. In this way, politics shrinks into the art of governing without disturbing the underlying order. But this narrowing has a price. If politics becomes only the administration of existing conditions, then the very possibility of transformation disappears. What once was seen as an open horizon, how should we live together, what values should guide us, is quietly foreclosed. We are left with the sense that everything important has already been decided, and all that remains is to fine-tune the machinery. It is here that Žižek insists on reopening the question: what would true politics look like? For him, the answer is not a nostalgic return to the slogans of the 20th century, nor a naive belief in benevolent experts. Instead, he provocatively revives the word communism, not in the sense of Soviet central planning, but as a reminder of something both urgent and forgotten, that we share a set of commons, the natural world, our digital knowledge, our fragile global economy, and that treating them as private property threatens our very survival. To speak of communism today is to insist that politics must grapple with the contradictions of our shared life, not merely manage them away. This chapter begins from that unsettling recognition that beneath the polished smiles of leaders lies the question of whether politics can still be more than administration. To explore Žižek's challenge, we will ask what it means to confront the contradictions of liberal democracy and why the radical task today might be to imagine a politics of the commons. When Žižek looks at the landscape of liberal democracy, he sees not so much a realm of freedom as a carefully contained space of negotiation. Citizens are encouraged to respect difference, to tolerate multiple lifestyles, to compromise in the name of harmony. On the surface, this seems admirable, yet Žižek argues that such tolerance functions like a safety valve. It allows for the expression of cultural variety while leaving untouched the deeper structures of inequality. One may celebrate multicultural cuisine or diverse festivals, but the global order of labor and profit remains quietly unchallenged. In this sense, politics slides into technocratic administration. Problems are acknowledged, but transformed into managerial issues. Rising temperatures, introduce carbon trading schemes, encourage green consumerism, widening inequality, offer tax credits, adjust interest rates, expand welfare bureaucracies. Crises appear as glitches in the system, never as signs that the system itself might require transformation. The vocabulary shifts from justice and struggle to efficiency and sustainability. Politics, once the stage for visions of collective destiny, becomes the craft of keeping the machine running without major disruption. It is against this backdrop that Žižek dares to reclaim the word communism. For him, this is not a call to resurrect the one-party states of the 20th century. Rather, it is a reminder of a simple but radical intuition. There are certain goods we hold in common, and their survival depends on collective stewardship. To name these commons is already to resist the ideology that treats everything as private property. The first and most urgent is ecology. The climate crisis reveals the absurdity of imagining that individual consumer choices can save the planet. Recycling bins and reusable straws are not meaningless, but they barely touch the structural drivers of ecological collapse. A logic of infinite growth, of oil companies planning decades ahead, of states locked into competition for resources. These forces cannot be offset by green shopping habits. To act politically here is not to ask each citizen to buy differently, but to confront the economic system that demands endless expansion. The second commons is knowledge and digital life. In a world where information travels at light speed, the temptation is to enclose it within walls of property. Pharmaceutical companies patent life-saving medicines, and tech giants hoard the data that citizens unknowingly generate. Knowledge, which flourishes when shared, becomes a scarce commodity. For Žižek, the paradox is stark. We have created tools that make universal education and communication possible, yet we prevent their full use through artificial restrictions. Politics in this domain would mean resisting the capture of information by private monopolies. The third commons is the global economy itself. Financial markets stretch across borders, binding nations into webs of interdependence. When a crisis erupts, as in 2008, governments mobilize trillions to rescue banks, while ordinary citizens shoulder the burden through austerity. Here again, repair replaces transformation. The same financial mechanisms are restored, waiting for the next inevitable collapse. Žižek's provocation is to say that our interdependence is not a matter of choice. It is a material fact. The question is whether we will organize it through the competition of states and corporations, or through some form of shared responsibility. This vision confronts both sides of the political spectrum. Against liberals, Žižek argues that tolerance without structural change merely decorates injustice with a human face. Against authoritarians, he warns that brute enforcement offers only simplistic and often violent shortcuts. Neither the polite language of inclusion nor the iron fist of nationalism is adequate to the contradictions we face. Here, Žižek turns to Hegel. The temptation of politics is always to imagine that contradictions can be dissolved, that balance can be restored, harmony achieved. But for Hegel, and for Žižek after him, contradictions are not mistakes to be eliminated. They are the truth of our situation. Real politics does not deny them, nor smooth them away, but enters into them fully. The task is not to conceal the fractures of our world, but to let them speak, and perhaps to reconfigure society in light of them. In this light, the administrative style of liberal democracy appears strangely evasive, even cowardly. By translating conflicts into technical adjustments, it ensures that nothing essential ever changes. Yet art and film often reveal what politics conceals, that beneath the veneer of order, the contradictions continue to smolder. In the next part, we will turn to cinema, dystopian worlds, and sharp satires where the failure of politics becomes visible, and where the question of the commons is staged in ways that statistics and policy papers cannot capture. Sometimes the most vivid way to grasp Žižek's critique of politics is not through policy debates or theoretical treatises, but through cinema. Films have a way of staging contradictions that everyday discourse glosses over. They build worlds in which our dilemmas are intensified, stripped of euphemism, and displayed as stark allegories. Consider Elysium, Neil Blomkamp's 2013 dystopia. The premise is simple. The wealthy live in a pristine orbital habitat, free of disease, while the poor remain on a ravaged Earth, struggling for scraps. At first glance, the problem seems solvable. If only the poor could access the medical technology of the elites, justice would be restored. The film's climax delivers exactly that, a sudden universal extension of healthcare. Yet the deeper structure is left intact, a society divided between those with the power to design the rules and those who merely suffer them. What Žižek might highlight here is how the solution is presented as a technical fix, as if pressing the right button could deliver justice, while the structural question, why must humanity live divided in the first place, remains unanswered. A similar dynamic appears in Snowpiercer, Bong Joon-ho's striking allegory of class struggle. Humanity's survivors live on a perpetually moving train, its cars arranged as rigid hierarchies, the poor packed in the tail, the elites dining in luxury at the front. Revolt means moving forward, car by car, battling through layers of privilege. Yet when the hero finally reaches the engine, he discovers the revolution has been anticipated, even required, to keep the system functioning. Progress within the train only reinforces the train itself. Žižek would read this as a parable of liberal democracy. One may contest who occupies which carriage, but the deeper question, why the train exists at all, and whether life outside its suffocating walls is possible, is excluded from discussion. True politics, then, begins when the possibility of derailing the train itself is acknowledged. Even an animated film like WALL-E speaks to the stakes of the commons. Earth is abandoned, covered in waste, while humanity floats in a corporate-run spaceship, lulled into passivity by screens and convenience. Ecological collapse, here, is not a wake-up call for collective responsibility, but a business opportunity for corporations to profit from cleanup and colonization. The film resolves with a sentimental return to Earth, but the paradox lingers. What happens when ecological crisis itself becomes a new domain of profit-making? In Žižek's terms, even the apocalypse can be commodified, turned into a market niche. To balance these dystopias, one might turn to satire, such as In the Loop. Unlike the cosmic stakes of sci-fi, this film depicts the banality of politics. Ministers fumbling for sound bites, civil servants spinning language until words lose all substance. Here, conflict is not explosive, but endlessly deferred, buried in committee meetings and bureaucratic confusion. If the train in Snowpiercer dramatizes repression through violence, In the Loop reveals repression through chatter. Both, however, demonstrate how politics avoids its own contradictions, either by enforcing order brutally or by drowning them in talk. Across these films, the pattern repeats. Liberal fixes, access to healthcare in Elysium, revolution within the train in Snowpiercer, corporate stewardship in Wall-E, bureaucratic doublespeak in the Loop, all ultimately sustain the logic of the system that produced the catastrophe. The technical solution patches the wound, but leaves the body politic-infected. What is missing is the courage to confront contradiction directly. Why is wealth hoarded? Why must hierarchy be preserved? Why is ecological ruin treated as collateral damage in the pursuit of growth? Cinema and satire thus become mirrors, reflecting back to us the evasions of our own politics. When policy debates present climate change as a market mechanism, or inequality as a matter of opportunity rather than structure, they echo the logic of these stories. Films exaggerate, yes, but in exaggeration, they clarify. They force us to see how politics as administration is insufficient, how the commons, our planet, our social bonds, our future, are at stake. This cinematic lens prepares us for the final turn. If films expose the failures of post-political management, the question remains, what would it mean to do politics differently? How might we, without retreating into authoritarian solutions, begin to imagine collective responsibility for the commons? In the reflective landing, we will step back from allegory to consider what Žižek offers as a provocation for our own time. We began with the image of politicians promising stability, as if politics were a careful balancing act of management. Through Žižek's lens, we have seen how this vision conceals as much as it reveals. Tolerance, compromise, technical fixes. These may smooth the surface of society, but they rarely touch its underlying fractures. Liberal democracy, in this form, becomes a way of avoiding conflict rather than confronting it. The paradox is sharp. In an age obsessed with private freedoms, the most radical gesture may be to insist on the commons. Ecology, knowledge, and the global economy bind us together whether we acknowledge it or not. To treat them as private possessions is to gamble with collective survival. And yet, the very language of politics often refuses this horizon. We are encouraged to recycle more diligently, to download our music legally, to trust in regulators, all while the engines of extraction, enclosure, and inequality continue at full speed. To protect the commons is to imagine a politics beyond administration, one that does not merely patch up crises, but addresses their roots. This does not mean a simple return to past ideologies, nor a faith in authoritarian shortcuts. It means entering into the contradictions of our time, freedom that relies on constraint, prosperity that produces ruin, connectivity that isolates. Žižek's provocation is not to hand us a ready-made program, but to force us to dwell in these tensions. The open question lingers. If our survival depends on shared responsibility, what forms of politics could take this seriously? In the next chapter, our focus shifts from the scale of society to the figure of Žižek himself, his method, his provocations, and the way he performs philosophy not by resolving contradictions, but by amplifying them. Chapter 10. The Žižek Method. Provocation as Philosophy. Imagine the scene. A crowded lecture hall, the air thick with anticipation. The philosopher paces restlessly across the stage, tugging at his shirt, sniffing, brushing his hair back with nervous hands. He begins not with a sober definition of ideology or a careful outline of Lacan's theories, but with a joke, crude, even embarrassing. The audience laughs uneasily, and before the laughter subsides, he leaps without warning into a digression about Kung Fu Panda or the architecture of European toilets. Then, just as suddenly, he pivots back to a weighty claim about freedom, desire, or the unconscious. It feels chaotic, even erratic. Yet those who have listened closely begin to suspect that this jumble of jokes, film clips, and contradictions is not a sideshow to the philosophy. It is the philosophy. This is the paradox of Slavoj Žižek. He appears to perform distraction, yet distraction is the method. He undercuts himself constantly. A serious point, followed by a dirty aside, a universal claim immediately reversed, a grand historical reference paired with slapstick humor. For many, it is baffling. Why would a thinker of such depth rely on humor that seems so out of place? Why derail a rigorous argument with tales of cinema and obscenity? To dismiss these gestures as eccentricity would be too easy. To see them only as performance would miss their function. Žižek's interruptions are not flaws in the machinery of his thought. They are the machinery. What unsettles the listener is precisely what keeps them attentive. The digressions break the illusion that philosophy is smooth, orderly, or neatly packaged. Instead, thought becomes an experience, unpredictable, disjointed, and alive. His jokes, his sudden shifts, his restless energy, these are not decorations but provocations designed to disturb our comfortable distance. Where most teachers aim for clarity, Žižek introduces confusion. Where most philosophers seek resolution, he insists on contradiction. The method is not to soothe, but to unsettle. So the question arises, why does Žižek teach in this way? Why is provocation, rather than explanation, his preferred form? Perhaps it is because the contradictions of his style mirror the contradictions at the heart of ideology itself. To understand Žižek, one cannot strip away the jokes and gestures to reveal a pure philosophy underneath. The philosophy is in the jokes, the gestures, the reversals. They are not accidents. They are the very form in which thought takes place. As we move deeper into this chapter, we will see why the method matters. Žižek's restless style is more than eccentric theatre. It is a strategy rooted in Hegel's embrace of contradiction and Lacan's recognition of the unconscious breaking through in slips and obscenities. To understand his philosophy is to see why provocation itself becomes pedagogy. At first glance, Žižek's style appears like a whirlwind without order. He begins with a heavy philosophical claim, breaks it with an off-color joke, leaps to Kung Fu Panda, detours through Hegel, and lands in Lacanian psychoanalysis before doubling back again. To the casual observer, it looks like distraction, even chaos. But the apparent lack of discipline is in fact the discipline itself. Žižek's method is not about guiding the audience to a smooth resolution. It is about forcing them to remain with contradiction, to experience philosophy as unsettled, restless, alive. This is where his debt to Hegel is most visible. Hegel's radical insight, was that truth does not emerge from erasing contradictions, but from inhabiting them. The dialectic does not work by reconciling differences into a peaceful unity. It works by showing how tension is constitutive of reality itself. Žižek performs this in his lectures. He states a position and immediately reverses it, mocks his own argument, or undermines the very point he has just made. To some, this feels like inconsistency. Yet to Žižek, it is fidelity to the dialectical truth. Philosophy is not the elimination of contradictions, but their embodiment. His thought never rests, because rest would be an illusion. Alongside Hegel, Lacan's shadow looms large. For Lacan, the unconscious is not a hidden depth waiting to be unearthed like buried treasure. It is something that slips out on the surface, in jokes, in slips of the tongue, in obscene humor. Žižek takes this principle and weaves it into his practice. When he breaks a dense theoretical point with a vulgar joke, it is not a lapse in seriousness, but an enactment of Lacanian insight. The unconscious speaks most directly in what seems inappropriate, embarrassing, or excessive. By placing such material at the center of his lectures, Žižek signals that philosophy cannot remain confined to polite discourse. It must let in the disruptive voice of the unconscious, even at the cost of making the audience uncomfortable. One of Žižek's favorite techniques is to reverse himself. He will make a point with apparent conviction, and then, a moment later, flip it around, exposing its opposite. This creates a sense of instability, but it is carefully staged. By refusing to let his audience settle into any one position, Žižek keeps thought in motion. A statement and its reversal are not mutually exclusive. Both together open a space where contradiction itself can be grasped. In his writing, he sometimes calls this the parallax view, the recognition that we can only see reality by shifting between perspectives that cannot be reconciled. The truth is not behind one perspective or the other. It is in the gap that separates them. His lectures enact this gap, producing a restless oscillation that keeps his audience thinking rather than consuming conclusions. This style is provocative, and it is meant to be. Žižek believes philosophy should not soothe, but disturb. In a world saturated with ideology, comfort is itself suspect. The very feeling that everything is fine is, for him, a sign that ideology is working smoothly. To break through that smoothness, philosophy must be abrasive. Jokes that shock, contradictions that confuse, examples that unsettle. All these work to destabilize the ideological ease of his audience. His pedagogy is not to transmit information, but to provoke discomfort, a discomfort that makes hidden assumptions visible. The result is that Žižek's form mirrors his content. Just as he claims ideology thrives on what we take for granted, his lectures disrupt the taken-for-granted form of philosophy. They show that to think is not to be reassured, but to be unsettled. To listen to Žižek is to be forced into the very contradictions he insists we must face. The contradiction between freedom and unfreedom, between desire and the other, between ideology and our cynical distance from it. In this sense, Žižek is not only describing philosophy, he is performing it. His digressions, jokes, and reversals are not detachable from his arguments. They are the arguments staged in the medium of performance. Philosophy here is not a transparent window to truth, but a theatre of provocation. The laughter he elicits, the irritation he provokes, the confusion he spreads, all of these are tools for loosening the grip of ideology and opening space for thought. And so, when he turns to cinema, to toilets, to dirty jokes, He is not abandoning philosophy for trivia. He is showing that philosophy lives in these interruptions, that the unconscious and the ideological are revealed most clearly in what we dismiss as marginal or embarrassing. To see this, we need examples, the very illustrations through which Žižek makes his point most vividly. Žižek's philosophy is not contained in abstract formulas alone. It is staged most vividly in his choice of examples, the very illustrations that at first seem absurdly trivial or inappropriate. These moments when he detours into toilets, children's films, or obscene jokes are where his method reveals itself most clearly. Take his famous reflection on toilets. With characteristic seriousness, Žižek explains the different ideological assumptions embedded in European, French, and American toilet designs. German toilets encourage inspection of one's waste. French toilets flush it away immediately. Anglo-American toilets strike a compromise between the two. What could be more banal than plumbing? Yet for Žižek, this is precisely the point. Ideology does not operate only in high politics or abstract thought, but in the very shape of our most intimate objects. Something as seemingly technical as a toilet becomes a silent education in how we are meant to relate to our own bodily excess. The laughter that erupts when he explains this in lecture halls is not simply amusement. It is recognition that ideology shapes us, even in places we consider utterly private, or consider Kung Fu Panda. Žižek seizes on the film's central twist. The sacred scroll that is supposed to contain the secret of Kung Fu turns out to be blank. The message is that there is no secret. The only power lies in believing that there is one. For Žižek, this is a parable of ideology itself. We act as if there is a profound truth holding society together. But when we look directly, we find nothing but a mirror of our own belief. A children's cartoon becomes, in his telling, an allegory of the Lacanian big other, the symbolic authority that exists only because we treat it as real. Again, the method is not to lecture abstractly about psychoanalysis, but to reveal it through the familiar fabric of popular culture. Another favorite example is Titanic. For most viewers, it is a tragic romance, but for Žižek, the ship is a floating diagram of class hierarchy. The rich occupy the upper decks, the poor are trapped below, and when disaster comes, the structure determines who lives and who dies. The iceberg is less important than the ideological arrangement of the vessel itself. What looks like sentimental entertainment becomes, under Žižek's interpretation, a lesson in how ideology structures even catastrophe. The laughter and discomfort this provokes in audiences is part of the pedagogy. They are forced to recognize that ideology is not only out there in political speeches, but in the stories we consume for pleasure. Sometimes the illustrations take the form of jokes that can be crude, even offensive. Žižek insists on these precisely because they pierce the polite veneer of philosophy. The obscenity shocks, but in the shock, something becomes visible. The way power often sustains itself not only through official dignity, but through hidden networks of humor, insult, and the unsaid. A joke told out loud illuminates what usually remains the obscene underside of ideology. What ties all these examples together is contradiction. Toilets as philosophy, cartoons as Lacan, blockbusters as political allegory. They overturn our expectations of what philosophy should look like. They unsettle the boundary between seriousness and frivolity, exposing how ideology saturates even the most unlikely corners of life. Audiences often laugh, sometimes groan, occasionally grow irritated. But Žižek welcomes these reactions. The laughter is not a distraction from thought, but its vehicle. The confusion is not a failure of teaching, but its success. Philosophy here is not about agreeing or disagreeing with a thesis, but about being disturbed into recognition. And so we see that Žižek's illustrations are not peripheral anecdotes. They are the stage on which philosophy performs itself. By provoking laughter, irritation, or bewilderment, they achieve what polished arguments alone cannot. They make us feel the contradictions ideology hides. This is why his method is inseparable from performance, a truth that takes us directly into the reflective landing of this chapter. By now, it should be clear that Žižek is not only a philosopher, but a performer, and that these roles cannot be separated. His restless gestures, his sudden jokes, his wild digressions are not quirks to be tolerated in order to reach the real philosophy hidden beneath. They are the form in which the philosophy exists. The performance is the philosophy. There is, in this, a paradox. Most teachers strive to deliver clarity, coherence, and closure. Žižek does the opposite. He circles, interrupts, reverses himself, and often refuses to provide a final answer. What remains is not a settled conclusion, but a sense of disorientation. And yet, this very refusal is itself a lesson. Philosophy's task is not to soothe or stabilize, but to unsettle, to break open the certainties we cling to. In a culture eager for reassurance, Žižek insists that true thought must leave us a little shaken. But this raises a deeper question. What do we really want from our thinkers? Do we look to philosophy for comfort, for guidance, for answers that fit neatly into the lives we already lead? Or do we dare to accept philosophy as disturbance, as a voice that unsettles us, perhaps even irritates us, but in doing so reveals the limits of our ideological comfort? Žižek forces us to confront this choice. And here we reach the threshold of the next chapter. For if Žižek's method is one of provocation, it is no surprise that it divides his audiences. Some see genius in the restless performance, others see only self-indulgence or clownishness. The very contradictions that animate his philosophy also fuel his critics. To understand Žižek fully, we must now turn to those criticisms, and to the paradox of a thinker who is, at once, ridiculed and revered. Chapter 11. Žižek's Contradictions and His Critics. Is Slavoj Žižek a profound philosopher, or merely a joker dressed in the costume of a philosopher? This is the question that often arises upon encountering him. His lectures are interrupted by constant sniffing, sudden digressions into cinema, or jokes that seem closer to late-night comedy than to serious theory. Detractors describe him as chaotic, repetitive, even unserious. Yet the very qualities that invite ridicule may also be central to his philosophical method. To watch Žižek speak is to witness a peculiar performance. He begins with an analysis of ideology, veers into Hitchcock or science fiction, tells a dirty joke, interrupts himself with a flurry of nervous gestures, and then lands unexpectedly on a sharp insight. To some, this is maddening, an endless detour with no clear direction. To others, it is precisely what makes him unique. He demonstrates how philosophy lives inside culture, in films, jokes, and slips of the tongue, rather than only in polished arguments. Consider his notorious example of toilets. Žižek compared German, French, and Anglo-American designs, arguing that even this most intimate space reflects ideological assumptions about purity, waste, and how we deal with what we prefer not to see. For many, this sounded absurd. Yet the absurdity is the point. Ideology is not confined to political speeches or economic systems. It permeates the smallest details of everyday life. By laughing at his analysis, we are already implicated in the very structures he seeks to expose. This is why Žižek is polarizing. Some accuse him of diagnosing problems without offering solutions, circling endlessly without closure. Others dismiss his clownishness as a distraction from serious philosophy. But perhaps the clown mask is not a disguise at all. Perhaps it is part of the revelation. The joke, the slip, the contradiction. These are not obstacles to truth, but the very means by which truth emerges. So we return to the question, is Žižek a philosopher or a joker? The paradox is that he is both, and that the tension between these roles may be where his thought truly lives. What if the very qualities that frustrate his critics, the excess, the contradictions, the repetitions, are precisely what philosophy requires today? The criticisms of Žižek often follow a predictable pattern. Admirers praise his energy and originality, while detractors insist that his brilliance comes without direction. He is, they argue, a master at diagnosing problems, exposing the hidden logic of capitalism, multicultural tolerance, or ecological panic. Yet when pressed for solutions, he dodges, stammers, or returns to a film reference. The charge is straightforward. He diagnoses without prescribing. But Žižek reframes this supposed weakness as philosophy's proper task. Philosophy, he suggests, should disturb rather than soothe, unsettle rather than prescribe. To insist on solutions too quickly is to risk reducing philosophy to management, a toolbox of fixes rather than an opening of thought. For Žižek, real thinking requires dwelling in contradiction, allowing uncertainty to generate new insights rather than covering it with premature clarity. This view is deeply Hegelian. For Hegel, truth emerges not from harmony, but from contradiction itself. The life of thought lies in tension, not resolution. Žižek echoes this when he contradicts himself, when he advances a claim only to undermine it in the next essay. Rather than hypocrisy, this reflects a dialectical method, circling, testing, and letting opposites illuminate each other. Lacan provides another angle. The unconscious, Lacan argued, reveals itself not in smooth coherence, but in slips, mistakes, jokes, or reversals. Žižek's inconsistencies, his habit of undermining himself, of saying yes and no in the same breath, can be read as symptomatic in this sense. The slip is not a failure, but a revelation. A perfectly coherent system would conceal the cracks where ideology seeps in. By exposing those cracks, Žižek lets us glimpse what coherence would otherwise suppress. His shifting stance on liberal democracy and communism illustrates this. Sometimes he acknowledges the strengths of liberal institutions, their fragile ability to secure freedoms. At other times, he insists that only a new communism, not the Soviet model, but a reinvention of collective responsibility, can confront ecological and technological crises. To critics, this is vacillation. To Žižek, it is dialectical exploration, refusing to collapse a complex situation into a single formula. The charge of entertainment follows a similar line. His lectures jump from chocolate laxatives to the Matrix to apocalyptic ecology. Critics groan, this is theatre, not philosophy. But defenders suggest the chaos is deliberate. By refusing linearity, Žižek enacts contradiction itself. The lecture becomes an experience of tension, of being unsettled, rather than a smooth transfer of information. Seen this way, the criticisms fold back on themselves. To say he offers no solutions confirms his refusal to give recipes. To call him contradictory highlights his Hegelian conviction that contradiction is truth. To dismiss him as entertaining proves his wager that jokes and detours may reveal what solemn systems conceal. The irritation remains real. How long can one dwell in contradiction before paralysis sets in? Yet perhaps this frustration is the point. If we leave his work unsettled, he may consider the encounter a success. These tensions become visible in cultural debates about his persona. A prominent moment came when the Chronicle of Higher Education accused him of recycling material, even of plagiarism. Critics saw proof of laziness, the same arguments repeated across essays and books. Yet defenders countered that repetition is central to his method. He circles the same concepts from different angles, much as Hegel reworked ideas again and again. What looks like redundancy may be dialectical deepening. His jokes invite similar ambivalence. For decades, Žižek has repeated the same handful of dirty stories. To some, this proves his unseriousness. Yet the jokes carry theoretical force. The story about European toilets is more than a gag. It illustrates how ideology infiltrates even private habits. The laughter exposes us to what we would prefer to overlook. Mockery of his sniffing, gesturing, and tangents often backfires, because the performance is not a distraction but part of his method. His clown persona blurs the line between entertainment and philosophy, unsettling the assumption that seriousness requires solemnity. Here, the comparison to Socrates is instructive. Socrates, too, was mocked for irony, for never giving answers, for corrupting youth with unsettling questions. He was accused of clownish disruption. Yet history remembers him as philosophy's gadfly, the one who refused to let complacency rest. Žižek may play a similar role. His clown mask disarms, but also pierces, leaving us less certain of the world we thought we understood. The very gestures that weaken him in the eyes of critics, repetition, jokes, eccentricity, are the ones that broaden his reach and deepen his impact. They provoke laughter, irritation, and reflection all at once. Žižek's contradictions remain, sometimes exasperating, sometimes illuminating, always central. Where critics demand clarity, he insists on paradox. Where audiences seek closure, he offers disruption. His repetitions, his slips, his clowning. These are not detours from philosophy, but its practice in a fractured age. The paradox is sharp. The traits that frustrate us are those that make him necessary. His clownishness unsettles academic solemnity. His contradictions resist ideological comfort. His refusal to offer tidy answers denies philosophy the role of a handbook. To wish him otherwise is to miss his wager. Philosophy should disturb, not soothe. Yet this leaves us with an open question. What do we want from philosophers? Certainty and guidance, or disruption and contradiction? Do we prefer comfort, or the unsettling presence of a thinker who leaves us restless? Žižek suggests that philosophy must keep us uncomfortable, because only in discomfort can truth emerge. And so his contradictions prepare us for the final step. Beyond the eccentricities and the disputes, why does Žižek matter today? What role does this philosopher clown play in a world already drowning in contradiction? That is where we now turn. Chapter 12. Why Žižek Matters Now. You open your phone and begin to scroll. A dozen shopping apps each present you with endless variations of the same t-shirt, the same headphones, the same gadgets, different colors, slightly different prices, the illusion of infinite choice. Later in the evening, The news plays in the background. A political debate reduced to the language of branding, candidates selling themselves like products, slogans tested in focus groups rather than convictions forged in conflict. And when the topic turns to the climate crisis, it appears as a lifestyle puzzle. Whether you should carry a reusable straw, buy an electric car, or sort your plastics more carefully, the world arrives not as tragedy or urgency, but as another arena of consumer choice. It is in this strange atmosphere, where politics appears as marketing and ecological catastrophe is framed as a question of personal preference, that we might wonder, why would anyone turn to a philosopher as unruly and contradictory as Slavoj Žižek? Why would his sniffing, joking, endlessly digressive style matter at all in such a hyper-managed reality? The paradox is that Žižek matters precisely because he refuses to provide us with the kind of polished answers that the marketplace of ideas already offers. Instead, he unsettles. He interrupts the flow of smooth consumer and political narratives, reminding us of what lies beneath. Where most voices in public life tell us what to believe, how to act, or how to optimize our choices, Žižek lingers on the gaps, the contradictions, the strange underside of things. When he insists that ideology is not simply what we consciously believe, but what structures our everyday rituals, our coffee runs, our film watching, even our jokes, he points to a deeper reality, one that resists neat packaging. In a time when our choices are plentiful yet strangely hollow, and our freedoms abundant yet strangely constrained, his role is not to soothe us with solutions, but to make us aware of the tensions we would rather not see. And perhaps this is why his voice feels so necessary now. In the landscape of options, where every crisis is repackaged as a product, Žižek asks us not to choose, but to pause, to notice the cracks, the absurdities, the contradictions that structure our world. His importance lies not in certainty, but in the discomfort he insists upon. What happens then if philosophy is not the art of answers, but the courage to dwell in the unresolved? This question leads us into a deeper exploration of Žižek's thought, a way of thinking that winds through ideology, desire, freedom, and politics, always returning us to contradiction as the very texture of truth. To understand why Žižek matters now, it helps to see how the many threads of his thought are not separate doctrines, but movements in a single symphony. He begins with ideology, but not in the old Marxist sense of false belief imposed from above. Instead, ideology lives in the smallest rituals of everyday life. We may laugh at the way people queue for Starbucks, but when you buy a latte with the promise that part of the profit supports ethical sourcing, you participate in a ritual that both critiques and sustains the system. The act allows you to feel resistance while deepening your place within consumer capitalism. Ideology, for Žižek, is not about deception. It is about how truth and illusion intertwine in practice. This perspective is sharpened by Lacan's psychoanalysis. Our desires are not spontaneous expressions of our inner self, but borrowed structures. We desire through the eyes of the other. We want not simply what pleases us, but what seems desirable in the symbolic order we inhabit. Fantasy, in this light, is not an escape from reality, but the very frame through which reality becomes bearable. Žižek's famous reversals remind us that when we think we are awake, we may be most deeply dreaming. When we imagine we are choosing freely, we may be most tightly bound. From Hegel, Žižek takes the conviction that truth itself is contradictory. Rather than smoothing over conflicts, Hegel invites us to see contradiction as the motor of reality, In Žižek's reading, to be human is not to resolve contradictions, but to live in them, to recognize that freedom is experienced most intensely in the very moment it feels like unfreedom, that desire feels most intimate when it is most alien. This is not a flaw in human existence, it is its deepest structure. Marx adds another dimension, the way capitalism thrives on crisis. Where Marx imagined contradictions would destroy the system, Žižek shows how those contradictions become new fuel. Ecological anxiety produces green consumerism. Critiques of fast fashion create new lines of sustainable clothing. Even rebellion is commodified as brand identity. Far from collapsing under critique, capitalism grows stronger by absorbing it. Here, freedom itself becomes a paradox. We scroll endlessly through Netflix or Amazon, free to choose among thousands of options, but trapped within the platform's horizon. In politics, we select between parties whose differences are often cosmetic, while the deeper logic of markets remains untouched. Choice proliferates, but real freedom contracts. Žižek extends this critique into the sphere of violence. We are quick to recognize the violence of riots or terrorism, but slower to see the violence that sustains everyday life. The anonymous systems that exclude, marginalize, or exploit without spectacle. Bureaucratic categories, debt arrangements, the quiet devastations of global inequality. These are the forms of violence that remain invisible precisely because they feel normal. Culture, for Žižek, is never trivial. Jokes, films, and even toilets reveal the underside of ideology. A dirty joke in a boardroom does not just break the ice, it sustains a hierarchy. A film like The Matrix is not just entertainment. It stages the very structure of our fantasies about freedom and control. Low culture illuminates high ideology, often more clearly than philosophy texts. From here, we move to politics. Žižek insists that the true horizon of politics today is the commons, the ecological commons of our shared planet, the digital commons of information, the biological commons of our genetic code. Liberal democracy, with its management and compromise, often avoids these questions. But in the face of climate change, digital monopolies, and biogenetic technologies, the question of collective ownership and responsibility cannot be deferred. Žižek's provocative call for a new communism is not nostalgia for the Soviet past, but a demand to rethink how we share what is most essential. His method is as important as his content. Žižek does not offer solutions in the way technocrats or activists do. He provokes, interrupts, jokes, contradicts himself. He unsettles us not because he is careless, but because philosophy, for him, must disturb comfort. A neat solution risks becoming another ideological product. A provocation, by contrast, resists absorption, leaving us restless, compelled to think further. Why does this matter now? Because we live in an age where spectacle overwhelms attention, where cynicism disguises itself as wisdom, where crises are commodified as lifestyle choices. Fake news feeds our cynicism. Climate breakdown is packaged as consumer dilemma. Digital capitalism thrives on distraction. In this landscape, Žižek's refusal to console or simplify becomes an act of resistance. He teaches us to see ideology at work, not in the grand illusions we can easily dismiss, but in the ordinary practices we barely notice. The value of his philosophy is not that it gives us an answer, but that it makes us feel the weight of the question. To be provoked, to be unsettled, is already to resist the passivity of managed life. And this brings us to the next stage, the power of illustration, where films, jokes, and rituals illuminate abstract truths more vividly than theory alone. Consider how climate change is so often presented to us. The news cycle tells us to recycle more carefully, to buy a metal straw, to consider an electric car. These gestures, however well-intentioned, frame the crisis as a question of personal lifestyle rather than structural transformation. The implication is that the fate of the planet hangs on whether you separate plastics correctly or skip a plastic bag at the supermarket. Žižek would insist that this is ideology at its most effective. It displaces attention from the systemic forces that drive ecological catastrophe, fossil fuel industries, global trade, the very architecture of consumer capitalism, and relocates it onto the individual shopper. You feel responsible, guilty even, but the system remains untouched. The paradox is that the more conscientious you become, the more fully you inhabit the ideological trap. Cinema captures this same tension with haunting clarity. When The Matrix appeared in 1999, it was embraced as a parable of liberation. The red pill promises freedom from illusion. Yet Žižek reminds us that even this liberation is structured. The choice itself is framed by the system you are trying to escape. To wake up is not to find some pure world outside ideology, but to encounter the unsettling truth that there may be no such outside. The film resonates because it stages our fantasy of freedom, while simultaneously revealing how even that fantasy is bound by limits. You think you are free when you choose, but the very horizon of choices has already been decided. Or take something as ordinary as a Starbucks ritual or the celebration of Christmas. Buying a latte that claims to support fair trade farmers allows you to consume with a clean conscience. Decorating a tree and exchanging gifts under the glow of holiday adverts creates a sense of communal warmth. But in both cases, the rituals serve as masks for deeper contradictions. The ethical latte is still part of a global system of exploitation. The Christmas cheer sustains a cycle of consumerism and debt. The ritual works because it allows us to enjoy while disavowing what we know. I know very well this is part of capitalism's machine, but all the same, I do it. The contradiction is not hidden, it is performed. These illustrations show how Žižek's thought does not hover above the world in abstraction. It unfolds in the supermarket aisle, in the cinema, in the holiday season. The stakes of philosophy are not confined to seminars. They are lived in the rituals and images that organize our everyday lives. What makes Žižek relevant is not that he delivers a new doctrine, but that he helps us see these scenes differently, to notice the paradoxes embedded in what feels most natural. And so, from plastic straws to Christmas lights, from red pills to green marketing, we begin to sense a pattern. Ideology is not simply an illusion to be pierced, but the very texture of our reality, which leads us to the final reflection. If even freedom, even joy, even our attempts at resistance are structured by ideology, what would it mean to truly awaken? Žižek matters today not because he has the solutions we crave, but because he unsettles the very space in which we seek them. At a time when politics is packaged like advertising, when ecological catastrophe is reduced to a question of personal recycling, when even rebellion is sold back to us as a brand, his refusal to soothe becomes a rare gift. He does not hand us a roadmap out of ideology. He reminds us that ideology is the terrain itself, woven into the rituals of our mornings, the films we love, the freedoms we take for granted. The paradox is that his lack of answers may be the deepest answer of all. By declining to close the circle, He forces us to linger in contradiction, to resist the temptation of neat closure. We discover that freedom feels most constraining when it is most abundant, that our desires are most alien when they feel most intimate, that our attempts at resistance can easily strengthen the very system we wish to escape. These are not reasons for despair, but invitations to think differently. To awaken, in Žižek's sense, is not to step outside ideology once and for all. It is to notice how each awakening reveals another layer, another fantasy, another ritual that sustains us. Perhaps the courage we need is not the hope of final clarity, but the patience to dwell in these reversals, to keep questioning when easy answers beckon. And so, this journey ends where it began, with the small gestures of everyday life, the coffee cup, the film, the joke. In them, ideology lives. Through them, contradictions surface. To pay attention is already to resist. Žižek leaves us, not with certainty, but with the quiet provocation to remain awake, even when the world tempts us to dream.